Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Josiah Briarpatch, and I've been walking these mountain ridges since Eisenhower was president. 17 years I've worn this ranger badge, patrolling the back hollows of George Washington National Forest, where most folks never set foot. My granddaddy worked these same mountains, and his daddy before him. We Briarpatches know every hidden trail, every secret cave, every place where the old Cherokee used to make camp. But there's one hollow I never believed the stories about. Not until October of 1962, when 4 hunters went missing and I had to go find them. Granddaddy used to tell tales about Devil's Backbone Hollow, how it was a place that ate people whole, how the Cherokee called it Hungry Earth. I always figured those were just old mountain stories, the kind that grow taller with each telling. After all, I'd never lost a person on my watch, not once in 17 years. The call came in on a Tuesday morning, fog rolling thick through the valleys like smoke, from a campfire. Jack Morrison and his hunting party, 4 men from Richmond, were 3 days overdue from their trip to the backcountry. Their wives were calling every hour, getting more frantic each time. I knew exactly where they'd gone. Devil's Backbone Hollow, 8 miles from Skyline Drive, where the deer trails run thick and hunters think they can bag a 10-point buck. It's a narrow ravine squeezed between 2 ridges, thick with rhododendron bushes and old-growth oak. Takes 6 hours of hard hiking just to reach the place, and that's if you know the way. I checked my gear that morning. Rope, first aid kit, emergency rations, my .38 service revolver. The October air was crisp, maybe 38 degrees, with that early frost smell that means winter's coming fast. I radioed dispatch to let them know I was heading out, then started up the old deer trail that would take me to the hollow's mouth. The hike started normal enough, squirrels chattering in the trees, crows calling from the ridge tops, the usual forest sounds I'd heard 1,000 times before. But as I got closer to Devil's Backbone, something felt wrong. The air got still. Too still. When I finally reached the hollow's entrance, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. No birds. No insects. Even the wind seemed to die as soon as it hit the tree line. I'd been in plenty of quiet woods before. But this was different. This was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. That's when I saw the boot prints. Fresh tracks in the mud, size 11 or 12, heading straight into the hollow. They looked maybe 2 days old, which would be about right for Morrison's group. I followed them for maybe 50 yards, taking notes in my pad like always. Then the tracks just stopped. Not like the person had turned around or stepped on rocks. The prints went for 50 yards in a straight line, clear as day, then just ended in the middle of a muddy patch, like whoever was walking had just vanished into thin air. I stood there, staring at that empty mud for a full minute, trying to make sense of it. In 17 years of tracking, I'd never seen anything like it. People don't just disappear mid-step. There had to be an explanation. But as I looked around that hollow, with its stunted trees and wrong-colored leaves, breathing air that tasted sweet and rotten at the same time, I started to remember Granddaddy's stories about the hungry earth. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if maybe those old tales weren't just stories after all. I followed the tree line around the hollow's edge, looking for more tracks, trying to find where Morrison's group might have gone. The temperature kept dropping the deeper I went. Had to be 15 degrees colder inside the hollow than outside. Made no sense. Weather doesn't work that way. My compass started acting funny too. The needle would swing north, then spin around like it couldn't make up its mind. When I checked my watch, it said I'd been walking for 3 hours, but it only felt like 30 minutes. Something was messing with my head, making time stretch and bend. That's when I found their camp. 4 orange tents set up in a neat row beside a creek that barely trickled water. The campfire was cold, but there were still beans in a pot sitting on the grate. Sleeping bags laid out, clothes folded on camp chairs. Everything looked normal, like the men had just stepped away for a few minutes, except there was nobody there. "Hello," I called out. "Jack Morrison. This is Ranger Briarpatch." My voice echoed back from the hollow walls, but it sounded wrong. Deeper, like something else was using my voice to call back to me. I searched through the camp, looking for clues. Found Morrison's wallet in his tent, $67 still inside. His rifle was propped against a tree, fully loaded. Nobody goes hunting and leaves their gun behind. Nobody leaves that kind of money, just sitting around. But it was the other things that really spooked me. Scratch marks on the oak trees, 10 feet off the ground. Too big for bears, too deep for wildcats. Whatever made those marks had claws longer than my fingers and strength enough to dig furrows in solid wood. The ground around the camp looked disturbed too. Not like animals had been digging, but like the earth itself had bubbled up from underneath. Little mounds of dirt scattered around, each one perfectly round, like something had pushed up from below and then settled back down. I was taking pictures of the scratch marks when I heard the first voice. "Help us." The call came from deeper in the hollow, maybe a quarter-mile away. Sounded like Morrison. I'd met him once before when he'd gotten his hunting license. "We're trapped." Another voice, younger sounding. "Can't find the way out." I grabbed my pack and headed toward the voices, following what looked like a game trail between the rhododendron bushes. The path twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the hollow than I'd ever been before. "Keep calling," I shouted back. "I'm coming to get you." But as I followed that trail, something felt wrong about the whole thing. The voices always seemed to be the same distance away, no matter how fast I walked. And the path itself seemed to stretch longer than it should have, like the hollow was bigger inside than outside. The sweet, rotten smell got stronger the deeper I went, like flowers left too long in a vase, or fruit gone bad in the sun. Made my stomach turn, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. The air itself seemed thick with it. Then I saw the cave. A black opening in the hillside, maybe 8 feet wide and tall enough for a man to walk through. The voices were coming from inside, echoing off stone walls I couldn't see. "In here," Morrison's voice called out. "We're stuck in here." I clicked on my flashlight and stepped to the cave mouth. The beam showed a tunnel heading straight back into the mountain, farther than my light could reach. The walls were smooth, too smooth, like they'd been carved by water over thousands of years. "How far back are you?" I called. "Maybe 100 yards, came the reply. "Hurry, something's wrong with this place." I keyed my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. The signal couldn't reach through all that rock. I was on my own. Looking back now, I should have left right then, should have hiked back to the road and brought a whole search team. But those voices sounded so scared, so desperate. They were counting on me to get them out. So I stepped into that cave, my flashlight beam dancing off walls that seemed to pulse like they were breathing. The voices kept calling, always just a little bit ahead, always just around the next bend. I'd walked maybe 50 yards when I heard my radio crackle to life behind me. "Josiah? You there, Josiah?" It was Bill Hawkins, my partner. "Dispatch sent me to back you up. Where are you?" I turned around, relieved to hear a friendly voice. But when I looked back toward the cave entrance, my blood went cold. The opening I'd walked through was gone. Just solid rock wall, like there had never been a cave there at all. I ran my hands over that rock wall, looking for any crack or seam, but found nothing. Solid stone, cold and smooth as glass. My flashlight beam showed the same tunnel stretching ahead of me, but behind me was just a wall that shouldn't exist. "Bill," I shouted, pounding on the rock. "Bill, can you hear me?" But my voice just echoed back down the tunnel, getting swallowed up in the darkness ahead. The voices of Morrison's group were still calling from deeper in the cave, but now they sounded different, more urgent, scared in a way that made my skin crawl. "Ranger, please hurry, it's got Charlie." "Got him how?" I called back, but they didn't answer. I had no choice but to keep moving forward. The tunnel sloped downward, and my flashlight showed side passages branching off in directions that made no sense. This cave system was bigger than anything that should exist in these mountains. The geology was all wrong. That's when I started hearing other sounds, not voices, but something else. A rhythmic thumping, like a giant heartbeat echoing through the stone. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, making the tunnel walls vibrate under my hands. I found Charlie Morrison about 200 yards in. He was stuck in the tunnel wall, not trapped behind rocks or caught in a cave-in. The stone had grown around him like tree bark around a nail, leaving just his head and one arm sticking out. His eyes were wide with terror, but when he saw my light, he tried to smile. "Thank God you're here," he whispered. "It's been pulling me in for hours. I can feel it. Digesting me." The rock around Charlie's body pulsed like living flesh. I could see the stone slowly flowing, creeping up his neck inch by inch. He was being eaten alive by the mountain itself. I grabbed his free hand and pulled, but it was like trying to move a boulder. The stone held him tight, and every time I tugged, he screamed in pain. "Get Jack," Charlie gasped. "He's further in, but don't let it touch you. The whole hollow is alive. It's been sleeping for God knows how long, and we woke it up." "How?" I asked, still pulling at his arm. "Our campfire. The smoke went down into the ground instead of up. That should have been our first clue. This thing feeds on people, animals, anything alive. And once you're inside, it won't let you go." Charlie's voice was getting weaker as more of his neck disappeared into the stone. "There's something else. The people from before. Civil War soldiers, Cherokee. They're all still here, still alive inside the rock. I can hear them whispering." As if to prove his point, I started hearing other voices echoing through the tunnels. Dozens of them, calling out in English and Cherokee and languages I didn't recognize. All of them pleading for help, all of them trapped somewhere in the stone around me. "The only way out," Charlie whispered, "is to feed it something else. That's what the old Cherokee figured out. Give it an offering, and it might let you go." Before I could ask what kind of offering, Charlie's head disappeared into the rock with a wet, sliding sound. The stone sealed over where he'd been, smooth and unmarked, like he'd never existed at all. I stood there in the dark, my flashlight shaking in my hand, listening to that giant heartbeat and the whispers of the dead. Every instinct told me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The tunnel behind me was sealed, and ahead was only deeper darkness. That's when I heard Jack Morrison calling from somewhere up ahead. "Ranger, I can see light. I think I found a way out." But his voice sounded wrong too. Too eager, too hungry. I started to understand that whatever was calling to me from the depths of that cave, it wasn't Jack Morrison anymore. I followed Jack's voice deeper into the tunnel, but now I knew better than to trust it. My flashlight showed the walls getting stranger as I went. Not just stone anymore, but something that looked almost like flesh. The heartbeat sound was getting louder, and I could feel the floor pulsing under my boots. The tunnel opened into a huge chamber, bigger than any cave had a right to be. My light couldn't reach the far walls, but what I could see made my stomach turn. The floor wasn't rock, it was soft and wet, covered in a film that looked like saliva. And scattered across that floor were the remains of hundreds of people. Not skeletons. These people were still alive. They were stuck in the flesh-like ground up to their waists or necks, their eyes wide and aware. Some wore modern hunting clothes, others had on Civil War uniforms, and a few were dressed in buckskin that had to be centuries old. All of them were being slowly dissolved, digested by the thing that lived under Devil's Backbone Hollow. "Welcome, Ranger Briar Patch." The voice came from all around me, spoken by dozens of mouths at once. Every person trapped in that chamber spoke in perfect unison, their voices blending into something that sounded almost like singing. "Your grandfather knew about us," the voices said. "He used to bring offerings, deer meat, sometimes rabbits. It kept us sleeping, kept us satisfied. But it's been 20 years since anyone fed us properly." I recognized some of the faces now. Jack Morrison was there, sunk up to his chest, his eyes glowing with the same light as all the others. Next to him were his 3 hunting buddies, all of them looking at me with expressions of terrible hunger. "We've been so hungry," they said together. "So very hungry. And you've come at just the right time." The floor started moving under my feet, trying to drag me down into the soft, digestive flesh. I jumped backward, but there was nowhere to go. The tunnel I'd come from was sealing itself, the walls flowing together like water. "You can't fight us," the voices said. "We are the mountain, we are the earth itself. Every root, every stone, every drop of water in this hollow belongs to us." That's when I remembered what Charlie had said about offerings. And I remembered Granddaddy's stories about the Cherokee, how they'd figured out how to keep the hungry earth sleeping. I pulled out my emergency rations, 3 days' worth of dried beef and hardtack, and threw them onto the chamber floor. The food sank into the flesh ground immediately, And for a moment the voices sighed with pleasure. More, they said. We need more. I cut my hand with my pocket knife and let the blood drip onto the ground. The flesh absorbed it greedily, pulsing with new life. Living blood, the voices whispered. Yes, but still not enough. We need a life. A whole life. Take me, I said. Let the others go, and take me instead. The voices laughed, a sound like wind through dead trees. You misunderstand, Ranger. We don't trade, we take what we want. But we are old, and we remember the agreements made long ago. The Cherokee taught your grandfather, and he taught you, though you didn't know it. The chamber walls started to shift and change, showing me images like pictures on a movie screen. I saw Cherokee shamans bringing deer to the hollow's mouth. I saw my granddaddy as a young man, leaving rabbits and field mice near the cave entrance. I saw years of offerings that had kept this thing sleeping, satisfied. The compact was broken when your grandfather died, the voices said. No one remembered their duty. So we woke, and we hunted, and we fed. What do you want? I asked. A new guardian, someone to remember the old ways, someone to feed us when the hunger grows too strong. Your grandfather served for 50 years. Will you take his place? I looked at all those trapped people, their eyes pleading with me. Jack Morrison and his friends, Charlie somewhere in the walls, hundreds of others stretching back through history, all of them alive, all of them suffering. If I agree, I said, will you let them go? The old ones, yes, they have served their purpose, but the fresh ones, they stay. They are already part of us now. It wasn't a good deal, but it was the only one I was going to get. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to help Morrison's group later. I accept, I said. The chamber floor opened like a mouth, and I felt myself falling through darkness, through stone and earth and time itself. When I finally stopped falling, I was standing outside the hollow's entrance, in the cold October air. Behind me, the cave was gone. Just solid rock, like it had never existed. But I could still hear the voices, whispering in my mind, telling me what I needed to do. I filed my report 3 days later. Rock slide, I wrote. Hunters trapped in cave-in, bodies unrecoverable. It was a lie. But nobody questioned it. Rock slides happen in these mountains, and sometimes people die. Bill Hawkins asked me about the weird radio calls he'd gotten, how he'd heard me talking to someone in a cave that wasn't there. I told him the acoustics in these hollows can play tricks on you, make sounds carry in strange ways. He believed me, or at least pretended to. I put in for a transfer the next week, told them I needed to be closer to the coast, that the mountains were getting too hard on my knees. They approved it without argument. I'd been a good ranger for 17 years, never caused any trouble. But I couldn't really leave, not completely. Every October, I drive back to Devil's Backbone Hollow. I park at the old trailhead and hike in with a cooler full of fresh meat. Deer when I can get it. Beef from the butcher when I can't. I leave it at the spot where the cave used to be, and I say the words my granddaddy should have taught me years ago. The meat is always gone by morning. Most years, that's enough. The thing stays sleeping, satisfied. But sometimes I can feel it stirring, restless and hungry, and I know it's going to need more than meat. Those are the years when hikers go missing, when hunting parties don't come back. I try to warn people away from the area. I got the Park Service to close some of the old trails, told them the rock was unstable after the slide. It helps, but it doesn't stop everyone. Some folks just don't listen to warnings. My grandson is 12 now, and he's started asking questions about the mountains, about the family stories. I've been teaching him the old Cherokee words, the ones Granddaddy should have taught me. He doesn't understand yet why it's important, but he will. Because someday, when I'm too old to make that October hike, someone else is going to have to feed the hollow. Someone else is going to have to keep the compact that keeps that ancient thing sleeping. The Cherokee called it hungry earth, but that's not really what it is. It's older than the mountains themselves, something that was here before the first tree took root or the first stream started flowing. It's patient, and it's clever, and it's always, always hungry. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I can still hear Jack Morrison and his friends calling for help from somewhere deep underground. They're still alive down there, still trapped in the thing's belly, still hoping someone will come save them. But nobody can save them now. The compact has been made, and the hungry earth has to be fed. That's the price of keeping the rest of the world safe from what lives under Devil's Backbone Hollow. That's the price my family has been paying for over 100 years. And God help me, it's the price we'll keep paying for 100 years more. Because some hungers never die. They just sleep, waiting for the next offering, the next guardian, the next fool who thinks the old stories are just stories. But I know better now. We briar patches have always known these mountains. And now the mountains know us too. My name is Ezekiel Colebrook, and I need to tell you what happened to me last February in the hills of West Virginia. I've been a park ranger for 13 years now, working the Monongahela National Forest. People trust me because I know these mountains like my own backyard, and I've always been straight with folks about what goes on out there. My grandfather worked coal mines his whole life. He used to say, coal dust gets in your blood and stays there forever. Maybe that's why I ended up taking care of these old mining areas. Somebody needs to keep people safe from the holes and tunnels they left behind. I specialize in what they call industrial archaeology. Sounds fancy, but it just means I deal with old factories, mines, and places where people used to work that are now dangerous. I know how to test air quality, check if old wooden supports are still holding up, and spot the warning signs before a tunnel caves in. I've got certificates in hazardous materials and structural engineering. This stuff matters when you're responsible for keeping hikers and families safe. February 2nd, 1974, started like any other winter day. Cold rain falling steady, turning the dirt roads to mud. I was sitting in my office going through reports when my seismic monitoring equipment started acting up. We use these machines to watch for ground movement, landslides, cave-ins, that sort of thing. But what I was seeing didn't make sense. The readings showed activity deep underground at Black Damp Ridge, about 15 miles northeast of my station. Problem was, those mines had been sealed up tight since 1889. Nobody was supposed to be anywhere near them. I pulled out the old maps and disaster reports from the county files. Black Damp Ridge Coal Company had operated there for about 20 years before everything went wrong. On March 15th, 1889, there was an explosion. Methane gas, most likely, killed 47 miners in one go. What made it worse was they never found the dead bodies. The blast brought down so much rock and timber that the rescue teams couldn't get through. Eventually, they just sealed the whole place up and called it a graveyard. The strange readings kept coming for 3 days straight. Every morning, the equipment showed movement in those tunnels, like someone was walking around down there, working. Every evening, everything went quiet. I knew I had to go check it out. Part of my job is making sure old mining sites stay safe and secure. If someone was messing around in there, treasure hunters, kids looking for adventure, or worse, I needed to know about it. The drive up to Black Damp Ridge took 2 hours on muddy back roads. My truck barely made it up the last mile, where the old mining road had washed out years ago. When I finally reached the site, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything was. No birds singing, no wind in the trees, just the sound of water dripping off bare branches. The main entrance to the mine was supposed to be sealed with concrete and steel bars. It was still blocked off, but something felt wrong. The concrete looked disturbed, like it had been moved recently, then put back. There were scratches in the mud that looked like footprints, but they were old-fashioned, like the kind of heavy boots miners used to wear. I set up my equipment and started testing the air around the entrance. What I found made me double-check my instruments 3 times. The air coming out of tiny cracks in the seal wasn't stale like it should be after 85 years. It was fresh, almost like someone had been breathing it recently. Temperature readings were wrong too. February in West Virginia, it should have been maybe 40 degrees. But the air from those cracks was warm, around 65 degrees. Deep mines usually stay cool year-round, not warm. As the afternoon wore on, I started hearing things. Faint sounds echoing from somewhere underground. At first I thought it was just water, dripping, or wind moving through cracks. But then I heard what sounded like metal hitting rock, rhythmic, like someone swinging a pickaxe. My grandfather always told me miners develop good ears. You learn to listen for the sounds that mean danger: cracking timber, shifting rock, gas leaks. What I was hearing didn't sound dangerous. It sounded like work. That's when I knew I'd have to go inside. Getting into the mine took me 2 days. I had to carefully remove some of the concrete blocks, document everything with photos, and set up proper safety equipment. This wasn't some adventure. If these tunnels collapsed with me inside, nobody would find my body either. I brought gas detectors, emergency breathing gear, rope, lights, and a radio that probably wouldn't work underground but might help if I got close to the surface. Everything by the book. The main tunnel was in better shape than I expected. The wooden support beams looked solid, and someone had been maintaining them. Fresh tool marks on the wood, newer nails in some places. But who could have been doing maintenance work in a sealed mine? About 100 feet in, I found the first impossible thing: a lunch pail sitting on a natural rock shelf. It was old-fashioned, the kind workers carried in the 1800s. Inside was food: bread, cheese, some kind of dried meat. It looked fresh. It smelled fresh. But when I picked up the bread, it crumbled to dust in my hands. The tunnel split into 3 directions. I chose the middle path because my gas detector was picking up the best air quality there. As I walked deeper, my footsteps echoed strangely. Sometimes it sounded like more than one person walking. Then I started seeing the lights. At first, just flickers in the distance, the kind of weak, yellow glow that old carbide lamps used to make. I'd call out, "Hello," and the lights would disappear. But as soon as I got quiet, they'd come back. About a quarter mile in, I found a work area that made my skin crawl. Fresh coal had been dug from the walls and piled neatly in mine cars, the old wooden carts they used to haul coal to the surface. Problem was, these carts had wheels that were rusted solid. They hadn't moved in decades. But the coal in them was new. I checked my air detector. Oxygen levels were perfect. Temperature was still that impossible 65 degrees. No dangerous gases. Everything should have been fine, but I felt like I was being watched. That's when I heard the singing. Welsh mining songs. My grandfather had taught me a few. Voices harmonizing deep in the tunnels, echoing off the walls. Beautiful and sad at the same time. The kind of songs miners used to sing to keep rhythm while they worked and to warn each other about cave-ins or gas. I followed the sound deeper into the mine. The tunnel opened up into a large chamber where several passages met. This was probably where the miners gathered for shift changes and meetings. In the center was a big wooden table, and on it were time cards. Handwritten time cards with names, dates, and hours worked. The dates were all from March 1889. The day of the disaster. But someone had been punching these cards recently. The ink was still wet. I picked up one of the cards. Thomas Macready, the 15th of March, 1889, shift start, 6 a.m. Under that, in different handwriting, March 16, 1889. Still working. Then the 17th of March, 1889, still working. The dates went on, right up to February 3rd, 1974. Yesterday, my hands were shaking as I put the card down. That's when I saw him. A man standing in the entrance to one of the tunnels. Tall, thin, wearing old mining clothes and a helmet with a carbide lamp. He was transparent. I could see the rock wall through his body. But his eyes were solid black, and they were looking right at me. "You're not supposed to be here during shift time," he said. His voice sounded like it was coming from far away, even though he was only 20 feet from me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. This was impossible. But he was there, talking to me. "Are you the new safety inspector?" he asked. "We've been expecting someone from the company. Some of the boys are worried about the gas levels in Shaft 7. I managed to find my voice. "The mine's been closed since 1889. There was an accident." He looked confused. "Accident? We haven't had any accidents. Been a good week for production." Though the mules seemed spooked about something. Then he was gone. Just disappeared like he'd never been there. I ran. I don't care how that sounds. I ran through those tunnels faster than I'd ever moved in my life. Behind me, I could hear voices calling out. Not angry voices. Worried voices. Like they were concerned about a fellow worker who was running into danger. "Come back, The evening shift isn't over. Watch for gas pockets near the entrance. Someone help that man, he looks lost. I made it to the entrance as the sun was setting. My equipment was still there, but someone had organized it. Coiled my ropes properly, cleaned my gas detector. Left a note written in old-fashioned handwriting. Thank you for the safety inspection. Please return tomorrow to check shaft 7, T. McCready, shift foreman. I drove home in the dark, checking my mirrors every few seconds. In my 13 years as a ranger, I'd never seen anything I couldn't explain. Now I didn't know what to believe, but I knew I had to go back. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thomas McCready's face. Those black eyes. The way he talked about the mine like it was still 1,889. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just exhaustion and bad air underground, maybe some kind of hallucination from old gas deposits. But I had to know for sure. This time I brought backup equipment and a camera. If something strange was happening in that mine, I needed proof. I also packed extra food and water. Whatever was going on down there, I wasn't going to let hunger or thirst make me see things that weren't real. The entrance looked different in daylight. Someone had been busy overnight. The concrete blocks I'd moved were stacked neatly to one side. A wooden sign had been posted. Black Damp Ridge Coal Company, day shift 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., visitors report to foreman. The sign looked old, weathered, like it had been there for decades. But I knew it wasn't there yesterday. Inside the mine, I could hear work going on, pickaxes hitting rock, men calling to each other, the creak and rattle of mine cars moving on rails. I followed the sounds, taking pictures of everything. My camera was working fine, but when I looked at the photos later, they were all wrong. The tunnels looked newer, brighter. Support beams that I knew were rotting showed up as fresh timber. And in several photos, there were men working, men I hadn't seen with my own eyes. I found the central chamber again. This time it was full of miners, 15, maybe 20 men sitting around the big table, eating lunch. They were all semi-transparent, like Thomas McCready, but they were talking and laughing like living people. When they saw me, they went quiet. Boys, this is the safety inspector I told you about, McCready said, standing up from the head of the table. He's here to check on the gas situation in shaft 7. The other miners nodded and went back to their food. One of them, a young man with red hair, looked up at me. First time in a mine, Inspector? You look a bit green around the gills. I've been in mines before, I said, surprised to hear my own voice. But not like this one. Black Damp Ridge is a good mine, said an older man with a thick Welsh accent. Been working here 5 years now. Company treats us fair, and the coal seam runs deep. Should be good for another decade at least. I wanted to tell them the truth. That the mine had been closed for 85. That they were dead, but looking at their faces, hopeful, hard-working, alive in every way except the obvious one, I couldn't do it. Could you show me shaft 7? I asked McCready. Course, follow me. He led me deeper into the mine than I'd ever gone. The tunnels here were smaller, older. The air was thick and hard to breathe. My gas detector started beeping warnings about methane levels. This is where we're having trouble, McCready said, pointing to a narrow passage that sloped downward. Gas has been building up for days. We've tried to clear it, but it keeps coming back. Some of the boys are afraid to work this section. I checked my instruments. The methane levels were dangerous, high enough to cause an explosion if someone lit a match or sparked their tools wrong. You need to evacuate this area, I told him. It's not safe. McCready looked confused. Evacuate? But we've got quotas to meet. The company's counting on us. The company doesn't exist anymore, I said without thinking. His face changed. For just a moment, he looked lost and scared. What do you mean? Before I could answer, one of the other miners came running down the tunnel. Foreman, there's been a cave-in near the main entrance. We're trapped. McCready's face went hard. How many men? All of us, sir, the whole day shift. I ran back toward the entrance with them. But when we got to the central chamber, I could see the tunnel to the outside clearly. No cave-in. No rocks blocking the way. But the miners were all standing around, looking panicked. We're trapped, one of them said. Just like before. Just like when? I asked. But they weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at something behind me. I turned around and saw more miners coming from the deeper tunnels. Dozens of them, all transparent, all wearing the clothes and equipment of men from 1889. The gas, McCready whispered. It's building up again, just like the day of the accident. What accident? I demanded. An old miner with a gray beard spoke up. March 15th, 1889. We were finishing the day shift when the methane reached a spark, big explosion, brought down half the mountain. That was 85 years ago, I said. They all stared at me like I was crazy. 85 years? McCready said. Son, that was yesterday. We've been working to clear the tunnels since then, trying to dig our way out. That's when I understood. They didn't know they were dead. In their minds, they'd been trapped since the explosion, working every day to escape, not realizing that decades had passed. Listen to me, I said. All of you. The explosion killed everyone. Your bodies were never found because the tunnels collapsed. You've been dead for 85 years. The miners looked at each other, confused and frightened. That's impossible, McCready said. We're standing right here. We're working. We're alive. Look at yourselves, I said. Look at your hands. Slowly, the miners looked down at their bodies. I could see the moment they realized the truth. Some became more transparent. Others flickered like candle flames. A few disappeared entirely. But not all of them accepted it. He's lying, shouted the young red-haired miner. He's trying to steal our jobs, drive us out so the company can bring in cheaper workers. That's right, said another. We've got families to feed. Can't let some stranger shut down our livelihood. The remaining miners started moving toward me. Their faces were angry now, desperate, and even though they were dead, I could feel their hands when they grabbed my arms. You're not leaving until we finish our shift, McCready said. Nobody abandons their post at Black Damp Ridge. I tried to pull away, but their grip was strong, real. They started dragging me deeper into the mine, toward the dangerous gas-filled tunnels where the explosion had happened. We'll show you what real work looks like, one of them said. Then you can write your report to the company. That's when I realized I might not be leaving the mine alive. They dragged me to the deepest part of the mine, where the methane was so thick my gas detector was screaming warnings. The tunnel was narrow here, barely wide enough for 2 men. The wooden support beams were old and cracked. This was where it had happened, where 47 miners had died in 1889. This is our workplace, McCready said, forcing me to my knees in the coal dust. This is where we earn our living. Around me, all 47 miners had appeared. I could see them clearly now. Transparent, but real enough to touch me, real enough to keep me trapped. They were all carrying the tools they'd died with. Pickaxes, shovels, carbide lamps that glowed with cold fire. We work every day, said the red-haired young man. Every single day for our families, for our children. Can't stop working. Can't let them starve. Your families are dead too, I said, trying to stay calm. Your children lived full lives and died of old age. It's 1974. The world has moved on. Liar, spat an older miner. My boy Jimmy is only 8 years old. My wife Sarah is waiting for me to bring home my pay. Look around you, I said. Look at this place. Does it look like a working mine? For a moment, they seemed to see what I saw. Rotted timbers, rusty rails, walls covered in 85 years of dust and decay. But then their vision changed back, and they saw the mine as it had been when they died. Looks fine to me, McCready said. Little bit of settling in the supports, but nothing we can't fix. That's when I understood what was really happening. They weren't just trapped by the cave-in. They were trapped by their own need to work. Coal mining wasn't just their job, it was who they were. Without it, they didn't know how to exist. What if I told you there was another, I said. What if you didn't have to work in the mine anymore? Don't have to work? The young miner laughed bitterly. Easy for you to say. You've got money, we've got families depending on us. I understand, I said. My grandfather worked coal mines his whole life. He told me stories about men like you, good men who worked themselves to death for their families. McCready's face softened a little. Your grandfather was a miner? Thomas Colebrook. He worked the Fairmont mines until they closed in 1950. Several of the miners looked at each other. Tom Colebrook? Said the old miner with the gray beard. I knew a Tom Colebrook. Young fellow, about 16 when I last saw him. This would have been 1,889, I finished. The day of the explosion. The old miner stared at me. That would make you his great-grandson, Ezekiel Colebrook. The miners went quiet. Finally, McCready spoke. If you're Tom's great-grandson, then you understand, you know, what it means to be responsible for family. I do, I said, and I know what my great-grandfather would tell you if he were here. He'd say the best way to take care of your family is to make sure they remember you as more than just workers. Make sure they remember you as men who knew when to let go. Easy words, said the young miner. But we've got quotas to meet. No, I said, standing up despite their hands on my arms. You don't. The quotas ended 85 years ago. The company is gone. The mine is closed. Your shift is over. I pulled out the photos I'd taken earlier, the ones that showed the mine as it really was. Decayed, empty, dead. I held them up so all the miners could see. This is what your workplace really looks like. This is what's left. For a long moment, the miners stared at the photos. Some of them began to fade. Others became more solid, more angry. Tricks, McCready said. Company tricks to get us to quit. I'm not from the company, I said. I'm from the future. From a time when your children's children have grown up and lived full lives because of the work you did. You don't need to keep working. You've done enough. The methane levels were getting dangerous. My detector was beeping constantly now. If something sparked down here, the explosion would kill me and probably bring down what was left of the mine. We can't stop, McCready said. But his voice was uncertain now. If we stop working, what happens to us? You rest, I said. You go home to the families that are waiting for you. Not the families you left behind, the ones that are waiting for you on the other side. But the coal, said another miner. Who'll dig the coal? Other people. Younger people. People with machines you never dreamed of. The work gets done. It always gets done. I could see some of the miners starting to understand. They were looking at their hands, their tools, their surroundings with new eyes, seeing the truth. But not all of them. I won't quit, said the red-haired young man. I won't abandon my post. He raised his pickaxe, and I could see a spark building where the metal met the wall. In this much methane, that spark would kill all of us. Stop, I shouted. You'll cause another explosion. Good, he said. Maybe this time they'll find our bodies. Maybe this time they'll know we died working. The spark was getting bigger. I could feel the gas around us reaching the point of ignition. In seconds, this tunnel would become a bomb. That's when McCready stepped forward and put his hand on the young miner's arm. Son, he said quietly, the shift is over, time to go home. The young miner looked at him with tears in his transparent eyes. But my family will be proud of you no matter what. You've worked enough, we've all worked enough. The spark died. The pickaxe fell from the young man's hands. And one by one, the miners began to fade away. Thank you, McCready said to me. Thank you for helping us understand. Then he was gone too, and I was alone in the dark tunnel with only my flashlight and the sound of gas hissing from the walls. I ran for the surface and didn't stop until I was breathing fresh air under the gray February sky. The mine explosion happened 3 days later. I was at my desk filling out reports when I felt the ground shake. Not much, just enough to rattle the coffee cup on my desk. But I knew what it was. The methane gas that had been building up in Shaft 7 had finally found its spark. When I drove back to Black Damp Ridge, the main entrance had collapsed completely. Tons of rock and earth had fallen, sealing the tunnels forever. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt final. I found the wooden sign that had appeared the day before, the one that said Black Damp Ridge Coal Company, day shift 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., visitors report to foreman. It had changed. Now it read, in memory of 47 good men who worked hard and died too young, shift ended the 7th of February 1974, rest in peace. I submitted my report to the Forest Service, recommending that the site be turned into a proper memorial. 6 months later, they installed a bronze plaque with the names of all 47 miners who died in the 1889 disaster. Families came from all over West Virginia for the dedication ceremony. Some of them were descendants of the dead miners, people who had never known exactly where their great-grandfathers were buried, The strange readings on my seismic equipment stopped completely after that February day. The temperature around the old mine entrance returned to normal winter levels. The birds came back to the trees. But sometimes, when I'm checking other abandoned sites in the forest, I find things that remind me of that week. Fresh tool marks on old timbers. Equipment arranged more neatly than it should be. Time cards with impossible dates. I think some of the miners chose to stay. Not to work, they understand that part is over, but to watch, to protect, to make sure nobody else gets trapped in those dark tunnels like they were. My grandfather lived until 1978. In his last years, he used to tell me stories about the mines that I'd never heard before. Stories about friends who died young, about the guilt of surviving when others didn't, about the dreams where he could still hear voices calling from deep underground. Coal dust gets in your blood and stays there forever, he'd say. But that doesn't mean you have to keep digging. I still work for the Forest Service, still check on abandoned mining sites, still make sure they're safe for the families who come to hike and camp and enjoy the mountains. But now I understand that my job isn't just about protecting the living. Sometimes you have to help the dead let go. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, in the quiet places where men once worked and died, you can still hear the echo of their voices. Not crying for help anymore, not calling for rescue, just saying goodbye. My name is Ezekiel Colebrook, and this is what really happened in the abandoned mines of Black Damp Ridge in February of 1974. I've never told this story before, because who would believe it? But 47 good men spent 85 years working in the dark, thinking their families needed them to keep going. Maybe it's time their story was told too. My name is Matthias Stillwater, and I've been a park ranger in Daniel Boone National Forest for 20 years. People say I was born for this job, walking these Kentucky hills like my feet know every root and stone. Maybe that's because my family has been chasing criminals through these mountains for 4 generations. My great-grandfather was a federal revenue agent back in the 1922. He spent his days hunting down bootleggers and smashing their stills during Prohibition. My grandfather became a sheriff. My father joined the state police. And me? I became a ranger. We Stillwaters have always been on the right side of the law. That's why I never believed in ghost stories or old wives' tales about moonshine that could hold memories. I'm a practical man. I deal with facts, poachers, illegal campers, drug labs hidden in the deep woods. The supernatural? That's just scared people making up stories to explain things they don't understand. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about August 1987, when everything I thought I knew about these hills got turned upside down. The drought that summer was the worst in 40 years. 6 weeks without rain, temperatures hitting 98 degrees every day. The streams ran low, the leaves curled brown on the trees, and the whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. Animals came down from the high country looking for water. And that's when the hikers started reporting strange things. 2 college kids from Louisville came into my station that Tuesday morning, excited and scared at the same time. They'd been following an old deer trail up into Copperhead Hollow, looking for a swimming hole they'd heard about. Instead, they found something else. "There's a whole setup back there," the boy said, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette. Old copper stills, wooden barrels, mason jars full of clear liquid. But here's the weird part. It all looked fresh, like someone was just there. His girlfriend nodded fast. The coals in the fire pit were still warm. And the moonshine? She stopped and looked at her boyfriend. "What about the moonshine?" I asked. "We tasted it," she whispered. "Just a sip. But when we did, we saw things. Old-time people working the stills, like we were watching a movie. Men in suspenders and women in long dresses. I wrote it all down, but inside I was rolling my eyes. College kids, probably drinking store-bought whiskey and letting their imaginations run wild. Still, illegal distilling was serious business. I had to check it out. The next morning, I loaded my pack with water, evidence bags, and my camera. I also brought my grandfather's old service revolver, not because I believed in ghosts, but because people protecting illegal operations can be dangerous. The trail to Copperhead Hollow was barely visible, overgrown with briars and honeysuckle. I'd been through this area before, but never this deep. The path wound down into a hidden valley where limestone cliffs blocked out most of the sky. Even at noon, everything felt shadowy and cool. The air smelled different down there. Not just the musty scent of old leaves and creek water, but something else, something sweet and sharp, like fermenting fruit. As I got closer to the bottom of the hollow, that smell got stronger. Then I saw it. The still complex sat in a clearing beside a natural spring, hidden so well you could walk right past it if you didn't know where to look. But what made my blood run cold wasn't just that it was there, it was the condition it was in. Everything looked perfect. Not old and rusty like you'd expect from equipment sitting in the woods for 60+ years, but clean and well-maintained. The copper stills gleamed in the filtered sunlight. Wooden barrels stood in neat rows. Mason jars lined wooden shelves like soldiers at attention, and from the nearest still, a thin stream of clear liquid dripped into a waiting jar. I've seen plenty of modern meth labs and grow operations in my time. I know what fresh activity looks like. This was fresh activity. But according to the records, the last legal distillery in this area had been shut down in 1923. That's when I remembered the stories my great-grandfather used to tell. Stories about a bootlegger family called the Whitmores, who had run the biggest operation in eastern Kentucky. Stories about the raid that ended it all. And how my great-grandfather had been there when the shooting started. Standing in that hollow, looking at impossible equipment that shouldn't exist, I felt something I'd never experienced in 20 years of law enforcement. I felt afraid. I spent the rest of that day documenting everything with my camera and taking notes. The more I looked, the stranger it got. The wooden barrels had fresh char marks inside, like they'd been prepared yesterday. The mash in the fermenting tanks was still bubbling. When I touched the side of the program, nearest still, the copper was warm. But there was no fire under it, no heat source at all. I found other things too. A newspaper from September 1923 folded neat on a wooden stool. The ink still dark enough to read. A pocket watch hanging from a nail, its hands frozen at 11:43. Tools arranged on a workbench like someone had just put them down and walked away. In the main cabin, I discovered something that made my hands shake. A ledger book filled with names, dates, and numbers. All the entries were in the same handwriting, and they went from January 1923 right up to August 1987. The last entry was dated 2 days ago. That's when I heard the voices. At first, I thought it was other hikers, maybe more college kids drawn by the stories. The voices were coming from deeper in the hollow, where the limestone cliffs formed a natural amphitheater. I followed the sound, my hand resting on my pistol grip. "Revenue agent's been sniffing around again," a man's voice said. "Ezra thinks they might know about the new batch." "Let them come," another voice answered. "We're ready for them this time." I crept closer, using the thick undergrowth for cover. Through the leaves, I could see figures moving around another still. 3 men in overalls and work shirts, a woman in a faded dress, and an older man with a gray beard directing their work. The strange part, I could see right through them. My rational mind tried to find explanations. Heat mirages, maybe, caused by the unusual weather, or hallucinations brought on by dehydration. But when one of the transparent figures looked straight at me, I knew I was seeing something that shouldn't exist. The bearded man pointed in my direction. "Someone's watching," he said. "Someone who don't belong." All 5 figures turned toward my hiding spot. Their faces were pale and serious, and their eyes seemed to look right into my soul. The woman spoke first. "He's got the look of a revenue man," she said. "Same eyes as the ones who came in 23. That's when I ran. I crashed through the underbrush like a spooked deer, not caring about noise or dignity. Behind me, I heard laughter that echoed off the limestone walls. Not mean laughter, but the kind you might hear from folks who just won a bet. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, 2 miles away. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. All the way back to town, I kept telling myself it had been a trick of the light, stress, too much sun. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. That night, I called my grandfather. He was 86 and living in a nursing home in Lexington, but his mind was still sharp. I told him about finding the Still complex and asked what he remembered about the Whitmore raid. The silence on the other end went on so long I thought he'd hung up. "Grandpa, you there?" "I'm here," he said finally. His voice sounded old and tired. "What exactly did you see, Matthias?" I told him everything, the perfect equipment, the warm stills, the transparent people. When I finished, he sighed like a man carrying a heavy burden. "Your great-grandfather never told the whole truth about that raid," he said. "The official report said the Whitmores opened fire first, that it was self-defense. But that wasn't how it happened." "What do you mean?" "The Whitmores weren't armed. They had their hands up, ready to surrender. But your great-grandfather, he said they couldn't let them live to testify about the bribes, about all the money that had changed hands to keep the operation running." My blood went cold. "Grandpa, what are you saying?" "I'm saying they murdered them, Matthias. All 7 of them, including 2 children, shot them down in cold blood and burned the bodies to hide the evidence. Then they wrote up a report about a gunfight that never happened." The phone felt heavy in my hand. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because, if what you saw is real, then the Whitmores are still there. And they've been waiting 64 years for justice." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee, and staring at the photos I'd taken. In some of them, if you looked real close, you could see shadows that didn't match the objects casting them. Shapes that looked like people, but weren't quite solid enough to be real. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was going back to Copperhead Hollow, not because I wanted to, but because I had to know the truth. This time, I wasn't going alone. I convinced my partner Jake Morrison to come with me the next day. Jake was a good man, steady and practical, with 15 years on the job. If anyone could help me make sense of what I'd seen, it was him. We hiked in together just after sunrise, when the mist was still rising from the creek. I'd told Jake about the illegal still, but left out the part about transparent people. No point in making him think I'd lost my mind before we even got there. The hollow felt different in the early morning light, quieter, somehow, like the whole place was waiting for something to happen. Jake whistled low when he saw the still complex. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "This is some serious operation. Look at the craftsmanship on those copper pipes." He walked over to examine the equipment while I hung back, watching for any sign of the figures I'd seen before. Everything looked normal in the daylight, old, but well-maintained, like a museum display of how moonshine used to be made. "Matthias, come look at this." Jake called from inside the main cabin. I found him standing over the ledger book, frowning. "This writing," he said. "Some of these entries are from last week. But look at the dates up top. This thing goes back to 1923. "Maybe someone's been using the same book for different operations," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. Jake flipped through more pages. The handwriting's all the same. Every entry, from 1923 to now. "That's impossible unless..." He stopped and looked at me. "Unless what, exactly?" Before I could answer, we heard the sound of metal clanking against metal from outside. Jake drew his weapon and motioned for me to do the same. We crept to the cabin door and peered out. The stills were operating. Not just dripping like before, but actively distilling. Steam rose from the copper coils, liquid flowed through the pipes, and the whole setup hummed with activity. But there was no one there, at least, no one we could see clearly. "Motion sensors?" Jake whispered. "Automated system?" I was about to answer when a mason jar lifted itself off a shelf, floated through the air, and positioned itself under a spout to catch the flowing moonshine. When it was full, invisible hands screwed on a lid and set it aside. Another jar immediately took its place. Jake's face went white. "What the hell is happening?" That's when we saw them, not solid like living people, but not completely transparent either. Figures moving around the stills, tending to their work like they'd been doing it every day for 60 years. The bearded man I'd seen before stood near the largest still, directing the others. "Federal agents," he called out, though his voice seemed to come from far away. Just like before. Just like that bastard Stillwater and his men. Jake grabbed my arm. Did he just say Stillwater? The woman in the faded dress looked right at me. "You've got his eyes," she said, "his grandfather's eyes. The one who killed my babies." I felt something cold wrap around my chest, making it hard to breathe. "We need to leave," I told Jake. "Right now." But when we turned toward the trail, 3 more figures blocked our path. Men in old-fashioned clothes, their faces hard with anger. One of them held what looked like a shotgun, though you could see the trees through his body. "No one leaves until justice is done," the man with the shotgun said. "We've been waiting too long." Jake raised his pistol, though his hands were shaking. "Stay back. This is a federal investigation." The ghosts, because that's what they were, no point pretending otherwise, laughed at that. The bearded man stepped forward. "Federal investigation," he repeated. "That's what they called it in 1923, right before they murdered my whole family." The temperature in the hollow dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Our breath came out in clouds, and frost formed on the metal equipment. Jake was backing toward the cabin, his eyes wide with terror. "Matthias," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what did your family do to these people?" Before I could answer, the ghost of Ezra Whitmore, because I knew that's who he was, spoke again. His great-grandfather led the raid. Came in at dawn with 6 other men, all of them armed and ready for war. We tried to surrender, put our hands up, told them we'd come peaceful, but they shot us down anyway, every last one of us. The woman stepped closer, tears streaming down her translucent face. "My children were 8 and 10 years old. They killed my babies and burned their bodies to hide the evidence." I felt sick to my stomach. "I didn't know," I said. "I swear I didn't know." "But you're here now," Ezra said. "A Stillwater, come back to the scene of his family's crime. Maybe it's time to balance the scales." The air around us began to swirl, leaves and dust spinning in tight circles. The mason jars on the shelves rattled, and the sound of the stills grew louder, more urgent. Jake was hyperventilating, his pistol pointed at shadows he couldn't really see. "They want to kill us," he gasped. "They want revenge." "Not him," Ezra said, pointing at Jake. "Just the Stillwater. The blood debt belongs to him." That's when I realized something important. These weren't just random spirits trapped in the hollow. They were specifically waiting for someone from my family to return. They'd been operating this still for 64 years, maintaining their equipment, keeping their skills sharp, all so they'd be ready when justice finally came calling. And I was that justice. The ghost children appeared then, the 8 and 10-year-old kids who died in the raid. They looked at me with wide, sad eyes that seemed to hold all the pain and confusion of dying too young and too violently. "Are you going to hurt us too?" the little girl asked. My heart broke right in half. "No," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to make this right." Jake looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Matthias, we need to get out of here. Radio for backup, call in the state police." "And tell them what?" I interrupted. "That we found a family of murdered bootleggers who've been making moonshine for 60 years after they died? They'll lock us both up." Ezra Whitmore studied my face with those hollow, ancient eyes. "You believe us," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," I said. "I believe you, and I think I know where to find proof." I told Jake to wait by the cabin while I approached the main still. The heat coming off the copper was real, even though there was no visible fire underneath. I reached out and touched the warm metal, and suddenly my head filled with images. I saw it all. The raid in 1923, happening exactly like Ezra had described it. Federal agents surrounding the hollow at dawn, my great-grandfather in the lead with his badge gleaming on his vest. The Whitmores coming out with their hands up, children hiding behind their parents' legs. And then the shooting started. Not because the Whitmores fought back, but because my great-grandfather gave the order. I watched him gun down unarmed men and women in cold blood. I saw him personally shoot the 2 children when they tried to run. I watched them pile the bodies and burn them, then pour kerosene on the still to destroy the evidence. But they missed something. A hidden cave behind the main operation where Ezra had stored his best moonshine and his most important records. Records that proved federal agents had been taking bribes for years to protect the operation. Records that would have destroyed careers and sent powerful men to prison. That's why the Whitmores had to die. Not because they were criminals, but because they knew too much about the real criminals, the ones wearing badges. When the vision ended, I found myself on my knees beside the still, tears streaming down my face. Jake was calling my name, but I could barely hear him over the sound of my own heartbeat. "Where is it?" I asked Ezra. "Where did you hide the evidence?" The old ghost smiled for the first time since I'd seen him. "Follow me." He led us to what looked like a solid limestone wall covered in vines. But when I pushed aside the vegetation, I found a narrow opening just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside was a natural cave about the size of a small room, and it was full of moonshine. Hundreds of mason jars lined stone shelves, each one filled with crystal-clear liquid. But more importantly, there was a wooden crate in the back corner filled with papers. Legal documents, correspondence, receipts, all proving that the Whitmore operation had been paying protection money to federal agents for 3 years before the raid. At the bottom of the crate was a ledger listing names, dates, and amounts. My great-grandfather's signature appeared on dozens of receipts, acknowledging payment. The final entry was dated 2 days before the raid. "Son of a bitch," Jake breathed, reading over my shoulder. "Your great-grandfather wasn't just corrupt, he was the kingpin. He was running protection for half the stills in eastern Kentucky." I nodded, feeling sick. And when Washington started pressuring him to produce results, he had to sacrifice someone. The Whitmores were the biggest operation, so they made the best example. But they had evidence of his corruption, Jake continued. So he couldn't just arrest them, he had to kill them all, I finished. Every witness. Ezra's voice drifted through the cave like wind through dry leaves. "Now you know the truth. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I looked at the evidence spread around us, documents that would rewrite the history books and destroy my family's reputation. My great-grandfather was a hero in these mountains, remembered as a lawman who died in the line of duty. Streets were named after him. There was a memorial statue in the county courthouse. All of it built on lies and blood money. "What do you want from me?" I asked the ghost. "Justice," Ezra said simply. "Tell the world what really happened. Clear our names and expose the truth about your family." "And if I don't?" The temperature in the cave dropped again, and I could see my breath. "Then we'll keep making moonshine until someone who will does," the old bootlegger said. "We've got all the time in the world." Jake was already loading documents into evidence bags. "We have to report this, Matthias. It's the right thing to do." I knew he was right, but I also knew what it would mean for my family, my career, everything I'd built my life on. The Stillwater name would become synonymous with corruption and murder. My father would die of shame. My own son would grow up knowing his great-great-grandfather was a mass murderer. But looking at those ghost children, still waiting for someone to acknowledge their innocence, I realized some things were more important than family pride. "Okay," I said to Ezra, "I'll tell the truth, all of it." The relief on the old ghost's face was immediate and visible. Around us, the other spirits began to smile. And for the first time since I'd entered the hollow, the air felt warm. Again, "Thank you," Ezra said. "That's all we ever wanted." The story broke 3 months later, after I'd worked with historians and journalists to verify every detail. The headlines were brutal. "Hero lawman, exposed as killer. Federal massacre, covered up for 64 years. The Whitmore family murders." My family didn't speak to me for 6 months. My father called me a traitor to our heritage. Some of my fellow rangers treated me like I had the plague, but I slept better than I had in years. The memorial statue came down. The street names got changed. And in the county courthouse, they put up a new plaque honoring the victims of the 1923 raid, including the 2 children whose names had been forgotten for more than half a century. I transferred out of law enforcement and into the Historical Preservation Division. Now I give tours of Copperhead Hollow, telling visitors the real story of what happened there. The Still complex is protected as a historical site maintained, exactly as the Whitmores left it. But the ghosts are gone. I went back the day after the story broke, and the hollow felt different. Empty, but peaceful. The stills were cold, the equipment silent. On the main workbench, someone had left a single mason jar filled with the clearest, most perfect moonshine I'd ever seen. I didn't taste it. Something told me it wasn't meant for me. Instead, I took it to the cemetery where we'd finally buried the Whitmore family's remains. I poured it out on Ezra's grave, watching it soak into the earth above a man who'd waited 64 years for justice. My son calls me now and then. He's 25, fresh out of college, and he's chosen a different path than the rest of the Stillwater men. He works for a nonprofit that helps Appalachian communities preserve their history and culture. I want to help people tell their real stories, he told me. Not the sanitized versions, but the truth, even when it's ugly. I'm proud of him. Sometimes, late at night, I still wonder about that moonshine. They say alcohol can hold memories, that it carries something of the people who made it. If that's true, then every jar in that hidden cave contains 60 years of waiting, hoping, and believing that someday someone would care enough to listen. The Whitmores got their justice in the end. But I learned something important. The truth doesn't care about your family name or your reputation. It doesn't care if it's convenient or comfortable. The truth just is. And sometimes, if you listen close enough to the wind in these old hills, you can still hear it calling. My name is Matthias Stillwater, and this is the story of how I learned that some debts can only be paid with honesty, no matter how much it costs you. The moonshine that remembers taught me that much. My name is Temperance Ridgway, and I've been pulling bodies out of these mountains for 15 years. People think being a park ranger is all about helping lost hikers find their campsite and making sure folks don't feed the bears. They don't know about the other part of the job, the part where you zip someone's kid into a body bag because the mountain decided it was hungry again. I should have known something was different about Sirens Point when I got the call that Tuesday morning in April. Third body in 2 weeks, all from the same cliff. All of them locals who knew better than to get too close to the edge of an 800-foot drop. Another jumper, Temp. Sheriff Morrison's voice crackled through my radio. His voice sounded tired, like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. Same spot, Cataract Falls. I was already reaching for my gear. Medical kit, climbing rope, body bag. The usual Tuesday morning setup, apparently. The hike to Sirens Point takes most people 2 days. I can do it in 6 hours if I push hard, and that morning I pushed harder than usual. Something about Morrison's voice made my skin crawl. In 15 years of working these mountains, I'd pulled plenty of bodies from that waterfall. Usually 1 or 2 a year, max. 3 in 2 weeks meant something was wrong. The Great Smoky Mountains in April are beautiful, in that dangerous way that makes city folks do stupid things. Everything's green and misty, and the waterfalls are running high from spring melt. Cataract Falls drops 800 feet down a granite cliff face, and the sound echoes off the rock walls like nature's own amplifier. It's the kind of place that makes people want to get close to the edge for a better look, too close. I grew up in these mountains, in a one-room cabin with a daddy who used his fists more than his words, and a mama who drank herself to sleep every night. I know what mountain despair looks like. I know how the isolation gets into your bones and makes you think dark thoughts. But I also know that most folks who grow up here develop a healthy respect for heights. You don't just accidentally fall off Sirens Point. The body was gone by the time I got there. Morrison had already called in the helicopter, but I could see where it had hit the rocks below. The blood was still fresh, dark red against the wet granite. A woman, he'd told me over the radio. Sarah Beth Hawkins, age 23, from the holler just east of the park boundary. I knew Sarah Beth. Sweet girl, worked at the general store in town, had a baby boy she was crazy about, last person you'd expect to take a header off a cliff. I set up my ropes and rappelled down to where she'd landed, even though I knew there was no point. Nobody survives an 800-foot fall onto granite. But you do it anyway, because that's the job, and because sometimes there are things to learn from the scene. Sarah Beth had landed face down, arms spread wide like she'd been flying. Her eyes were still, open, staring at something I couldn't see. But what made my stomach clench was the expression on her face. She looked peaceful. Happy, even. Like she'd finally found what she was looking for. I'd seen a lot of bodies in my time. Accident victims usually look surprised or scared. Murder victims look angry. But Sarah Beth looked like she'd just come home from the best day of her life. That's when I first heard it. Just at the edge of my hearing, mixed in with the constant roar of the waterfall, there was something else. A sound like singing, low and sweet, coming from somewhere up above. I looked around, thinking maybe there were other hikers nearby, but the trail to Sirens Point is technical climbing. You don't just wander up here by accident. The singing stopped. I finished documenting the scene and climbed back up to the top of the falls, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The mist from the waterfall made everything hazy and dreamlike, and, more than once, I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there except wet rock and mountain laurel. I radioed Morrison to confirm the recovery was complete, then started the long hike back to my truck. But as I was packing up my gear, I found something that made me stop cold. Carved into a tree about 10 feet from the cliff edge, still fresh enough that sap was bleeding from the cuts, were 3 words: "Come back home." The letters were carved deep, like someone had spent a long time working on them. But Sarah Beth had been found at dawn, and the carving was definitely fresh, which meant either she'd spent her last night carving a message into a tree, or someone else had been up here recently, someone who wanted people to know that Sirens Point was calling them home. I couldn't get Sarah Beth's face out of my head. 3 days later, I was still thinking about that peaceful expression when my radio crackled to life again. "Temp, we got a problem." Morrison sounded even worse than before. "Got a missing person report. Jimmy Caldwell, age 19. Family says he went hiking yesterday morning and never came back." "Where was he headed?" Long pause. "Cataract Falls." I was already grabbing my gear when Morrison added, "And Temp? His mama says he's been acting strange the past few days. Talking about hearing voices, calling him up to the mountain." The Caldwell place was a 40-minute drive into the deeper hollows, where the roads turn to gravel and then to dirt, and the houses get farther apart until you're not sure if you're still in civilization or if you've driven clean out of the world. Jimmy's mama, Ruth, met me at the door before I could knock. "He's been different since Sarah Beth died," she said, wringing her hands in her apron. "Said he heard her calling to him. Said she wanted him to come up to the falls." Ruth Caldwell was a practical woman who raised 5 boys, mostly by herself after her husband died in a mine accident. She wasn't the type to spook easy, but her face was gray with worry. "When did he leave?" I asked. "Yesterday morning, right after breakfast. Said he had to go see about something. Wouldn't tell me what." She paused, looking up toward the mountains. "But he's been having dreams, Mr. Ridgway. Dreams about voices calling him home." The hike to Sirens Point felt different this time. The usual sounds of the forest birds, squirrels, the distant sound of water seemed muted, like someone had put a blanket over the whole mountain. The mist was thicker too, even though it hadn't rained in 3 days. I found Jimmy about halfway up the trail to the falls. He was sitting on a fallen log, staring up toward Sirens Point with a dreamy expression on his face. His lips were moving, like he was having a conversation with someone, but when I got close enough to hear, he wasn't making any sound at all. "Jimmy," I called out. "Jimmy Caldwell?" He turned to look at me, and I felt my blood run cold. His eyes were completely unfocused, like he was looking through me at something far away. But he smiled when he saw me, the same peaceful smile I'd seen on Sarah Beth's face. "She's calling," he said simply. "Can't you hear her?" I stopped about 10 feet away. In 15 years of mountain rescue, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming that something was very wrong. "Who's calling, Jimmy?" "Sarah Beth. She says it's time to come home." He stood up slowly, like an old man with arthritis, even though he was only 19. "She says it's peaceful down there. Says all the pain stops." That's when I heard it again. The singing, low and sweet, coming from the direction of the falls. But this time it was clearer, and I could almost make out words. A woman's voice, calling someone's name over and over. Jimmy heard it too. His whole face lit up with joy, and he started walking toward the sound. "Jimmy, stop." I moved to block his path. "You need to come back down the mountain with me. Your mama's worried sick. Mama doesn't understand," he said, still smiling that dreamy smile. "None of them understand. The mountain wants us back. We've been away too long." He tried to step around me, and I grabbed his arm. The moment I touched him, I felt it a cold that went deeper than skin, deeper than bone. It was like touching something that had been dead for a long time. But Jimmy was warm and breathing, and very much alive. The cold was coming from somewhere else. "Let me go," he said, and his voice was different now. Older, like someone else was talking through him. "Let me go home. I've had training in crisis intervention, dealt with plenty of people in mental health emergencies. But this felt different from any psychological break I'd ever seen. Jimmy wasn't just confused or delusional, he was being pulled toward something, and that something was pulling back. The singing got louder. I could hear words now, clear as day. "Come home, Jimmy. Come back to us. The water's warm, and the pain stops here." Jimmy's eyes rolled back in his head, and he started walking toward the cliff. Not the stumbling walk of someone in a trance, but the purposeful stride of someone going exactly where they wanted to go. I tackled him. We went down hard on the rocky trail, and Jimmy fought like his life depended on it, which, I was starting to realize, it probably did. He was stronger than he should have been, and for a few seconds, I wasn't sure I could hold him down. "The mountain is calling," he screamed, clawing at the ground, trying to drag himself toward the sound of the falls. "I have to answer. I have to go home." I managed to get my emergency sedative kit out of my pack and gave him a shot in the shoulder. It took 3 times the normal dose to calm him down, and even then he kept mumbling about voices and going home. I radioed for a helicopter evacuation and stayed with Jimmy until help arrived. The whole time, the singing continued, sometimes close enough that I thought I could see movement in the mist near the falls, sometimes so faint I wondered if I was imagining it. But I wasn't imagining the way Jimmy kept trying to crawl toward the sound, even sedated. And I wasn't imagining the way the temperature dropped whenever the singing got louder, like something cold was moving through the forest. As the helicopter lifted off with Jimmy strapped to a stretcher, I heard one last thing that made my heart stop. Mixed in with the sound of the rotors and the wind, I heard my own name being called from the direction of the falls. A woman's voice, sweet and familiar, calling me home. A voice I recognized from my childhood, from before I escaped these mountains and made something better of my life. My mama's voice, calling me back to the place I'd spent my whole adult life trying to forget. They kept Jimmy in the psychiatric ward for 3 days. I visited him twice, and both times he seemed normal, confused about what had happened, embarrassed about his behavior, grateful that I'd stopped him from doing something stupid. The doctor said it was probably a psychotic break brought on by stress and grief over Sarah Beth's death. But on the 3rd night, Jimmy walked out of the hospital in his pajamas and bare feet. Security footage showed him leaving through the emergency exit at 3:17 a.m., walking with the same purposeful stride I'd seen on the mountain. They found his body at the bottom of Cataract Falls 12 hours later. This time, I wasn't the first one on scene. Sheriff Morrison had beaten me there, along with 2 state investigators and a psychiatrist from the regional medical center. Jimmy's death had gotten attention from outside the county, and suddenly everyone wanted to know why 3 locals had killed themselves at the same spot in less than a month. But I was the only one who heard the singing. It started while we were still processing the scene, soft and low, like a lullaby. The psychiatrist doctor, Sarah Chen, her name was interviewing me about Jimmy's mental state when I held up a hand to stop her. "Do you hear that?" I asked. She paused, listening. "Hear what?" The singing was getting louder, and now I could make out multiple voices, all harmonizing together. Women's voices, calling names I recognized from the local obituaries. Sarah Beth's voice, Jimmy's grandmother, who died the winter before. And underneath it all, still my mama's voice, calling my name. "The singing," I said. "You don't hear the singing, doctor?" Chen looked at me with the same expression she'd probably used on Jimmy. "Mr. Ridgway, there's no singing, just the waterfall." But Morrison heard it. I could tell by the way his face went pale, and he kept looking up toward the top of the falls. He didn't say anything. Morrison's not the type to admit to hearing voices, but I saw him back away from the cliff edge. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the voices calling, and every time I started to drift off, I felt that bone-deep cold, like something dead was breathing on the back of my neck. At 2 a.m., I gave up trying to sleep and drove back up to Siren's Point. I told myself I was going to figure out what was happening. Maybe there was a natural explanation, some kind of acoustic phenomenon caused by the waterfall or infrasound that could affect people's brain chemistry. I'd read about places where the geology created subsonic vibrations that made people feel uneasy or even suicidal. But deep down, I knew I was going because the voices were calling me, and despite everything I'd seen, part of me wanted to answer. The trail at night was different. darker, obviously, but also somehow more alive. Every shadow seemed to move. And more than once I thought I saw figures walking parallel to me through the trees, just out of range of my flashlight. The singing started when I was still a mile from the falls. Not the faint, distant singing I'd heard before, but clear and close, like someone was walking right beside me. Multiple voices now, calling different names. I heard Jimmy's name, and Sarah Beth's, and a dozen others I didn't recognize. And my name, always my name, in my mama's voice, calling me home. I reached the clearing around Siren's Point just as the moon came out from behind the clouds, and what I saw there made me stop breathing. There were people standing around the edge of the cliff, dozens of them, maybe more, all facing the waterfall. Men, women, children, all perfectly still, all perfectly quiet except for the singing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I raised my flashlight, and the beam passed right through them. They weren't really there, or they were there, but not in any way that mattered to things like light or gravity or the normal rules of physics. I could see the rock face through their bodies, could see the mist from the falls swirling through them like they were made of smoke, but I could also see their faces clearly, and I recognized some of them. Sarah Beth was there, still wearing the clothes she died in. Jimmy stood beside her, his hospital pajamas fluttering in a wind I couldn't feel. And behind them, row after row of others, people I'd known, people I'd heard about, people who died on this mountain going back generations. They were all looking at me. "Come home, Temperance," my mama's voice said, and one of the figures stepped forward. She looked exactly like I remembered her from when I was 12, before the drinking got really bad, before Daddy's fists got harder, before I learned that home wasn't a safe place to be. "Come back to us, baby girl. The water's warm and all the hurt stops here." I wanted to go to her. More than I'd ever wanted anything in my life, I wanted to walk to the edge of that cliff and step off into her arms. The pull was so strong it felt like gravity, like the mountain itself was tilting toward the falls. But 15 years of mountain rescue had taught me something about dangerous situations. When you feel like you're being pulled toward something that will kill you, you anchor yourself to something solid, and you fight. I drove my ice axe into the ground and wrapped the safety line around my wrist. "You're not real," I said out loud, as much to convince myself as to challenge whatever was standing at the cliff edge. "You're all dead. Mama's been dead for 20 years. The singing stopped. The silence was so sudden and complete that it felt like the world had ended. Even the waterfall seemed muted, like someone had turned down the volume on reality. Then my mama spoke again, and her voice was different, colder, angry. "You left us, Temperance. You ran away and never looked back. You could have helped us, could have saved us, but you chose to save yourself instead." The guilt hit me like a physical blow, because she was right. I had run away. When I turned 18, I'd taken my high school diploma and what little money I'd saved, and I'd gotten out of these mountains as fast as I could. I'd left my mama to drink herself to death, left my younger cousins to grow up the same way I had, left a whole community of people to struggle with poverty and addiction and despair while I made something better of myself. "You owe us," Mama said. And now all the other spirits were nodding, moving closer. "You owe us a life. Come home, baby girl. Come pay your debt." I was crying now, the tears hot on my face in the cold mountain air, because part of me believed her. Part of me had always believed that I was responsible for everyone I'd left behind, that my escape had somehow made their suffering worse. But another part of me, the part that had survived 15 years of pulling other people's pain out of these mountains, knew that guilt was a liar. "I don't owe you anything," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. "You're not my mama. My mama died in a cabin 20 miles from here, and she never once set foot on this mountain." The figure claiming to be my mama smiled, and for just a second, I saw what was really behind that familiar face. Something old and hungry and absolutely not human. "Smart girl," it said, and the voice wasn't my mama's anymore. "But you'll come to us eventually, they always do. The mountain is patient, and the dead are eternal." All the spirits began to fade, becoming transparent, then smoke, then nothing at all. But before they disappeared completely, I heard one last thing. "We'll be waiting." I didn't sleep for the next 2 days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces at the cliff edge, heard that thing wearing my mama's voice telling me I owed a debt. But more than that, I felt the pull, a constant tugging sensation in my chest, like something had hooked itself around my heart and was slowly reeling me in. Dr. Chen called me on Thursday morning. Mr. Ridgway, I've been researching the acoustic properties of waterfall environments, and I think I may have found something that explains what you're experiencing. I met her at the ranger station, hoping she might have some kind of scientific answer that would make everything make sense again. She had charts and graphs spread across my desk, all showing sound wave patterns and frequency measurements. Infrasound, she said, pointing to a series of jagged lines on her computer screen. Sound waves below the range of human hearing, usually between 3 and 20 hertz. They can be generated by waterfalls, wind patterns, geological activity, and they have documented effects on human psychology, anxiety, uneasiness, even hallucinations. Hallucinations, I repeated. The feeling of a presence, auditory hallucinations, visual disturbances. It could explain everything, the voices, the sense of being watched, even the suicidal ideation. Your brain is being bombarded with subsonic frequencies that trigger psychological distress. It sounded reasonable. Scientific? The kind of explanation that let you sleep at night and go back to work in the morning. But it didn't explain the tree carving. It didn't explain how Jimmy had walked out of a locked psychiatric ward. And it definitely didn't explain why only some people were affected while others, like Dr. Chen herself, heard nothing at all. What about the people who don't hear anything? I asked. She paused. Well, sensitivity to infrasound varies from person to person. It could be that the affected individuals have some kind of neurological predisposition, or what? Or there's some other factor at play that we don't understand yet. That afternoon, I drove up to the Caldwell place to return some of Jimmy's personal effects. Ruth was in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds with the kind of fierce concentration that meant she was trying not to think about something. I know you did everything you could, she said without looking up when I told her how sorry I was about Jimmy. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. She straightened up, dirt on her hands, tears in her eyes. Did you hear them too, the voices? I nodded. Jimmy's daddy heard them, she said quietly, right before he died in that mine accident. Came home talking about voices calling him deeper into the mountain. Said he had to go see about something. Next day, the tunnel collapsed on him and 3 other men. Ruth. And my daddy before that. And his daddy before him. Going back 5 generations, Mr. Ridgway. Men and women in my family, hearing voices, walking into danger, dying in ways that don't make sense. She looked up toward Sirens Point, visible in the distance. That mountain's been feeding on us for a long time. That night, I did something I should have done days earlier. I went to the county library and started researching the history of Cataract Falls. What I found made my blood run cold. The first recorded death at Sirens Point was in 1891. A woman named Mary Caldwell, Jimmy's great-great-grandmother, who jumped from the cliff after claiming her dead husband was calling to her. The newspaper article described her as previously of sound mind and cheerful disposition. After that, 1 or 2 deaths every year. Sometimes more during hard economic times, or after mine accidents, or during particularly harsh winters. Always locals. Always people with family connections to previous victims. Always people who had been heard talking about voices in the days before their deaths. But the pattern went back further than the newspaper records. I found references in old diaries, church records, even Native American oral histories that Dr. Murphy at the university had collected in the 1960 seconds. The Cherokee had a name for Sirens Point that translated roughly to the place where the hungry spirits gather. They'd considered it cursed long before the first white settlers arrived. I was still in the library at closing time when Mrs. Patterson, the librarian, came to tell me they were locking up. She was an old woman who'd lived in the county her whole life, and when she saw what I was reading, her face went pale. You shouldn't be researching that place, she said quietly, especially not you. Why especially me? She hesitated, then sat down across from me. Because your family's connected to it too, honey. Your mama's people, the Bradshaws. They lost more folks to that mountain than any other family in the county. I felt that cold sensation again, the one I'd felt when I touched Jimmy. What do you mean? Your first great-grandfather. Thomas Bradshaw. Walked off that cliff in 1923, left behind a wife and 4 children. Said he heard his dead brother calling him home from the war. My hands were shaking now. My mama never told me that. Your mama spent her whole life running from family history. The drinking, the meanness in your daddy, it was all ways of trying to quiet the voices. But they came for her anyway, in the end. She died of liver disease. Mrs. Patterson shook her head sadly. She died of liver disease in a cabin 20 miles from here. But 3 days before she died, she told the visiting nurse that she could hear singing coming from the mountains. Said her daddy was calling her home. I drove straight from the library to Sirens Point, even though it was past midnight and I had no business being on a mountain trail in the dark. But I finally understood what I was dealing with, and I knew that if I didn't face it now, tonight, I was going to spend the rest of my life running from voices that would eventually catch up to me. The singing started before I even got out of my truck. This time it wasn't just my mama's voice, or Sarah Beth's, or Jimmy's. It was a chorus of dozens, maybe hundreds of voices, all calling my name, all telling me to come home. I recognize some of them now: my great-grandfather Thomas, my cousin Billy, who died in a car accident 5 years ago, neighbors and friends and family members going back generations. They were all waiting for me at the cliff edge. But I also understood something else now. The thing I was dealing with wasn't my family. It wasn't the spirits of the dead at all. It was something else, something that had been feeding on the pain and despair of mountain families for more than a century. Something that had learned to wear familiar faces and speak in beloved voices. Something that had been hunting my bloodline for 4 generations. I walked to within 10 feet of the cliff edge and stopped. "I know what you are," I said to the assembled spirits. "You're not them, you're just wearing their faces." The singing stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and loud in my ears. "Smart girl," said the thing wearing my mama's face. "But knowing doesn't change anything. You still owe a debt. Your family has always owed a debt." "What debt?" For the first time, all the spirits smiled at once. And the sight was so horrible I had to look away. When I looked back, they had changed. Now I could see what they really were, not the peaceful dead, but something else entirely, something with too many teeth and eyes like holes in the world. "The debt of the living to the dead," it said in a voice like grinding stone. "The debt of those who escape to those who are left behind. You took yourself away from this place, made yourself better, stronger, happier. That happiness has to be paid for." By who? By you. By your cousin Billy, when his time came. By your family, your neighbors, your community. By anyone with the blood of this place in their veins. The thing leaned forward, and I could smell the scent of decay and deep water. "We are the hunger of the mountain, girl. We are the weight of all the suffering that has happened here, and we will not be satisfied until every debt is paid." I understood then. This wasn't about individual guilt or family curses. This was about something much older and hungrier, a kind of spiritual parasite that fed on entire communities, generations of people bound to a place by blood and history and shared suffering. But I also understood something else. "You can't take anyone who doesn't choose to come," I said. "You can call, you can tempt, you can make them feel guilty, but in the end, they have to walk to that cliff edge themselves." The thing smiled wider, and they always do. Sooner or later, they always do. The guilt eats at them, the voices wear them down, and eventually they come home. Not me. Oh, especially you. You're the one who got away, who made something better of herself while everyone else stayed and suffered. Your guilt runs deeper than all the others combined. It was right. The guilt was there, had been there my whole adult life. Every success I'd had, every good day, every moment of happiness felt stolen from the people I'd left behind. I'd built my new life on the foundation of their suffering, and part of me had always believed I deserved to pay for that. But 15 years of pulling other people's pain out of these mountains had taught me something else. Guilt was not the same as responsibility, and suffering was not the same as debt. "I don't owe you anything," I said, and this time I meant it. "I don't owe my family anything. I don't owe this place anything. I saved myself from a bad situation, and that's not a crime." The thing wearing my mama's face snarled, and for a moment I saw its true form, something vast and ancient and absolutely hungry, something that had been feeding on human misery since before the mountains had names. "You will come to us," it said. "If not tonight, then tomorrow. If not tomorrow, then next week. We are patient, and the dead are eternal," I finished. "Yeah, you mentioned that. But here's the thing about eternity, it goes both ways." I pulled out my emergency flare and lit it, the red light driving back the shadows and revealing the cliff edge for what it really was, just rock and water and empty air. "I'm not going anywhere," I said. "And I'm going to make sure no one else does either." The flare light seemed to burn the spirits away like smoke, and for the first time in days, the mountain was quiet except for the natural sound of falling water. I stood there for a long time, waiting to see if they would come back, but the pull in my chest was gone, and the voices had finally stopped. It took me 3 months to convince the Park Service to restrict access to Sirens Point during high water periods. I had to use words like acoustic phenomenon and geological instability instead of hungry mountain spirit, but the end result was the same. No more easy access for people in crisis. I also started something else, a support group for families in the mountain communities, people dealing with generational trauma and poverty, and the kind of despair that makes dark voices sound like salvation. Dr. Chen helped me set it up, and we met every Tuesday evening in the community center. Ruth Caldwell was one of the first to join, so was Mary Hawkins, Sarah Beth's mother. Slowly, we began talking about the real reasons people walked up to Sirens Point, not supernatural hunger, but very human pain that had been passed down through families like a genetic disease. The voices never came back for me. Whatever had been feeding on the mountain seemed to have lost interest once I stopped feeling guilty about surviving. But I knew it was still there, waiting for the next person carrying enough pain to make them susceptible to its call. 6 months after Jimmy's death, I got a call from a park ranger in West Virginia. They'd had 3 suicides from the same overlook in a month, all locals who'd been heard talking about voices, calling them to come home. I packed my gear and drove the 4 hours to Beckley, carrying copies of everything I'd learned about infrasound and community trauma intervention and the ways that isolation can make people vulnerable to their own darkest thoughts. Because that's what I'd figured out in the end. The thing at Sirens Point wasn't really supernatural, it was just very, very old. Old enough to have learned how human communities work, how pain passes from generation to generation, how people can be made to feel responsible for things that aren't their fault. It was the spiritual equivalent of a parasite. And like any parasite, it couldn't survive in a healthy host. So now I travel between mountain communities, helping set up support networks and crisis intervention programs. I teach people about the warning signs of suicidal ideation, about how to get help for depression and addiction and domestic violence. I help families talk about their histories honestly, without shame or guilt. And sometimes, late at night when I'm staying in a motel between small towns, I still hear singing in the distance. Not my mama's voice anymore, but other voices, older voices, hungrier voices, calling from mountains I haven't visited yet, but I don't feel guilty about it anymore. I don't feel responsible for every person I can't save or every community I can't heal. Some debts are real, and some debts are lies we tell ourselves to make sense of pain that doesn't have an explanation. The difference between the two is what keeps me on this side of the cliff edge. Last week, I got a letter from Ruth Caldwell. She's started her own support group in the next county over, and she wanted me to know that they hadn't lost anyone to Sirens Point in 8 months. "The mountain's still hungry," she wrote, "but we're not feeding it anymore. That's how you kill a thing like that, not with flares or weapons or ancient rituals, but by refusing to give it what it needs. By choosing to live instead of die, by helping each other instead of suffering alone, by believing that people deserve better than the worst things that have ever happened to them. The mountains are still beautiful, and the waterfalls still sing their ancient songs. But now when people hear voices calling them home, they know the difference between the pull of the past and the promise of the future. Most of the time, that's enough." My name is Cornelius Flintlock, and I've been a park ranger in Jefferson National Forest for 18 years. My family's been in these Blue Ridge Mountains since before the Revolution. My great-great-great-grandfather, Josiah Flintlock, was one of the first settlers to push into this wilderness back in the 1750 seconds. Growing up, I heard all the old stories about how tough those early pioneers were, how they carved homes out of nothing and survived winters that would kill a modern man. I never believed half of what I heard. How could I? People today complain when the power goes out for a few hours. The idea that folks back then could survive months cut off from civilization, living on what they could hunt and grow, seemed like tall tales to make the past sound more heroic than it really was. That changed in November 1984. I was leading a team of archaeologists from Virginia Tech to a site deep in the primitive area. Dr. Sarah Chen had gotten permission to investigate what satellite photos showed might be old settlement ruins. The spot was 20 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by hiking trail. November in these mountains means business. We'd already had 2 light snows, and the Weather Service was calling for a major storm system moving in from the west. "Are you sure about this, Cornelius?" Dr. Chen asked as we loaded our packs that Tuesday morning. The temperature was already dropping, and gray clouds hung low over the ridges. We could wait until spring. I shouldered my pack and checked my compass. "If we don't go now, you'll be waiting 6 months. This area gets snowed in from December through March. Besides, I know these mountains like my own backyard. My ancestor used to hunt these same trails." The hike took us 8 hours through thick forest and over 2 mountain ridges. The trees were mostly bare, their black branches reaching up like skeleton fingers against the gray sky. Our boots crunched through frozen leaves and patches of old snow. Every step took us further from the modern world and deeper into the kind of wilderness my ancestors had called home. We made camp that first night beside Whispering Creek, about 2 miles from the site. The temperature dropped to 30 degrees, and I could smell more snow coming. The forest was dead quiet except for the creek babbling over rocks and the occasional hoot of an owl. "Tell us about your ancestor," said Mike Rodriguez, one of the graduate students, as we sat around our small campfire. "The one who settled around here." I poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks drift up into the darkness. "Josiah Flintlock came through these mountains in 1754 with about 25 families. They were looking for good farmland, someplace they could build a proper town. Found a hidden valley about where we're headed tomorrow. Perfect spot. Fresh water, good soil, protected from the worst weather." "What happened to them?" Dr. Chen asked. "Nobody knows for sure. The winter of 1755 was the worst on record. When the first traders came through in spring, the whole settlement was gone. No bodies, no signs of what happened. Just empty cabins and cold fire pits." Mike laughed nervously. "Spooky. Think we'll find their bones tomorrow?" I didn't answer right away. Something about the darkness beyond our fire felt different that night. Heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. My grandmother always said they tried to settle land that didn't want to be settled. Said some places are meant to stay wild. The next morning brought the kind of cold that bites through your clothes and settles in your bones. 22 degrees with a wind that cut like a knife. I could taste snow in the air as we broke camp and headed toward the coordinates Dr. Chen had marked on her map. We found the site just after noon. I'd been expecting maybe some foundation stones, a few rotted logs, the kind of scattered remains you usually find from old settlements. What we discovered stopped me dead in my tracks. There, hidden in a natural bowl between 3 ridges, sat a complete colonial village. 23 log cabins arranged around a central common area, with a meeting house, a gristmill by the creek, and even a small church with a wooden cross still standing on its roof. The buildings looked like they'd been finished yesterday. "This isn't possible," Dr. Chen whispered, setting down her pack. She was right. Wood exposed to 230 years of weather should be gray and rotting. These logs were still golden brown, the chinking between them still tight and white. Wooden shingles that should have been blown away decades ago sat perfectly in place. Even the glass windows, real glass, not the oiled paper most frontier settlements used, were unbroken and clear. I walked up to the nearest cabin and pushed open the door. It swung easily on leather hinges that should have crumbled to dust generations ago. Inside, the furniture sat exactly where someone had left it. A wooden table with 4 chairs. A bed frame with rope supports. Cooking pots hanging on wall pegs. Everything covered in a thin layer of dust, but otherwise untouched by time. "Cornelius," Mike called from the fireplace. Come look at this. I walked over. He was kneeling beside the stone hearth, holding his hand near the ashes. These are still warm, he said. The warm ashes changed everything. Doctor, Chen went from excited archaeologist to nervous scientist in about 10 seconds. She started taking pictures and making notes while Mike and the other students spread out to examine the other buildings. I stood in that cabin doorway, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Someone had been here recently. Recent enough to leave warm coals in a fireplace, but we'd hiked 20 miles through wilderness to get here. The nearest trail was barely visible, and we hadn't seen any other footprints. In the snow. More importantly, who would build a fire in an abandoned settlement and then just leave? Dr. Chen, called Amy Hoffman, another graduate student from across the common area. You need to see this. We hurried over to where she stood outside what looked like a bakery. Through the open door, I could see a long wooden table covered with loaves of bread, not moldy, ancient bread, fresh bread that still smelled like yeast and flour. I don't understand, Doctor, Chen said, stepping inside carefully. This bread can't be more than a day old. I picked up one of the loaves. It was still soft. When I broke it open, steam actually rose from the inside. The bread was warm. Someone's playing a joke on us, Mike said, but his voice shook. Has to be. Someone knew we were coming and set this up. How? I asked. We didn't tell anyone our exact location. And look around. This isn't a few props someone hauled in for a prank. This is an entire village. I was starting to feel that heavy sensation again, like the forest was watching us. The clouds had gotten thicker during the morning, and even though it was only early afternoon, the light was dim and gray. The wind had picked up too, making the bare tree branches creak and groan. Let's check the other buildings, Doctor, Chen said. Document everything. There has to be an explanation. We spent the next 2 hours going through the settlement building by building. Each one was perfectly preserved and showed signs of recent use. The blacksmith shop had tools laid out on the workbench and coals glowing faintly in the forge. The general store had goods arranged neatly on shelves, barrels of flour and salt, bolts of cloth, even glass jars filled with what looked like preserved vegetables. In the meeting house, we found something that made my blood run cold. A large wooden table surrounded by chairs, with papers scattered across its surface. I picked up one of the documents and read it, by the gray light filtering through the windows. It was a town council meeting record, written in the careful handwriting of someone with good education. The date at the top read November 15th, 1755. The meeting had been about winter preparations, how much firewood had been cut, which families needed help with food stores, plans for hunting parties if the snow got too deep. Look at this, Amy said, pointing to another paper. It was a list of families and their winter supply status. 25 families, just like in the stories my grandmother had told me. At the bottom, someone had written in different ink, "Storm coming, God help us all." That's when we heard the church bell ring. It was a single, clear tone that echoed across the valley and sent birds exploding from the trees. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. The sound came again, one deep bronze note that seemed to hang in the cold air. "Wind," Mike said quickly. "Just the wind moving the bell." But there wasn't enough wind, and church bells don't ring themselves with single, measured strokes. This sounded like someone was pulling the rope with purpose. "Doctor," Chen gathered up the papers with shaking hands. "We need to set up proper documentation equipment. This site is..." She paused, looking around the meeting house with its hand-hewn beams and carefully crafted furniture. "This site is impossible." I was thinking the same thing, but for different reasons. I'd grown up hearing stories about this place, about how Josiah Flintlock's settlement had vanished without a trace during the worst winter anyone could remember. How search parties the next spring had found nothing but empty land. But here it was, exactly like my grandmother had described it, down to the arrangement of the buildings and the location of the creek. Either someone had used those old stories to build an incredibly detailed replica, or... The bell rang again. 3 times, slow and deliberate. "We should go check the church," I said, though every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and hike out of this valley as fast as possible. "Good idea, Doctor," Chen said. "Amy, start photographing everything in here." Mike, you and Rodriguez get the measurement equipment from the packs. I want exact dimensions and material analysis. I walked outside alone, heading toward the small wooden church at the far end of the settlement. The building was simple but well crafted, with real glass windows and a proper wooden door instead of just a hide hanging. Someone had taken time and care with its construction. The door was slightly open. I could see darkness inside, broken by thin shafts of gray light from the windows. As I got closer, I heard something that made me stop dead. Singing. It was faint but unmistakable. A hymn in the style my grandmother used to sing, with that old-fashioned melody that seemed to rise and fall like mountain wind. Multiple voices, harmonizing the way people do when they've sung together for years. I stood outside that church door for a full minute, listening to voices sing a song I'd heard at my grandmother's funeral 15 years earlier. The same words, the same tune, the same mountain accent that marked these hills. Finally, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The church was empty. 20 wooden pews faced a simple altar with a wooden cross mounted on the wall behind it. Afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes floating in the air. But there was no one there. The singing had stopped the moment I opened the door. I walked down the center aisle, my boots echoing on the wooden floor. Everything looked normal, too normal for a building that was supposed to be over 200 years old. The wood floor was worn smooth by generations of feet, but it wasn't rotted or warped. The windows were clean. Even the altar cloth looked fresh. On the altar, I found an open Bible. The pages were yellow with age but still perfectly readable. It was open to Psalms, and someone had underlined verse 23. 4 inches faded ink. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That's when I heard footsteps on the porch outside. I turned toward the church door, expecting to see Dr. Chen or one of the students. Instead, I saw a shadow move past one of the windows, the shape of a person, but somehow wrong, too tall, or maybe moving in a way that didn't quite match how humans walk. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I waited, holding my breath, but no one came in. After what felt like forever, I walked back up the aisle and pushed the door open. The porch was empty, but there, in the thin layer of snow that had fallen during the morning, I could see footprints. Bare feet, which made no sense in this weather. The prints were deep and clear, and they led from the church steps directly toward the center of the settlement. I followed them, my heart pounding harder with each step. The tracks went past the meeting house, past the bakery where we'd found the fresh bread, and stopped right in the middle of the common area. Just stopped, like whoever made them had simply vanished into thin air. Cornelius, Dr. Chen's voice came from one of the cabins. Come here, quick. I found her in what looked like a family home, the largest cabin in the settlement. She was standing in the main room, staring at something on the wooden table. This was here when we arrived, she said, pointing. I'm sure of it. But look. On the table sat a wooden bowl filled with what looked like stew. Steam was rising from it, and I could smell meat and vegetables. Beside the bowl was a wooden spoon and a piece of that same fresh bread. Someone just served this, Doctor, Chen said, while we were here, while we were walking around documenting everything. I picked up the spoon. It was still warm from someone's hand. Where are Mike and the others? I asked. Rodriguez is measuring the blacksmith shop. Amy's still in the meeting house. Mike, she paused, looking around. I thought Mike was with you. We'd been split up for maybe 30 minutes. In a settlement this small, you should be able to see or hear everyone. But when we called Mike's name, we got no answer. We found him in the mill beside the creek. He was standing perfectly still in front of the water wheel, staring at the wooden gears like he'd never seen such a thing before. When we called his name, he didn't respond. Doctor. Chen had to grab his shoulder and shake him before he seemed to notice we were there. Mike, are you all right? He blinked and looked around like he was waking up from a deep sleep. What? Yeah, I'm fine. Just looking at this machinery. It's fascinating how they engineered the gear ratios, but his voice sounded different. Flatter. And he was using words Mike didn't normally use. In 3 years of graduate school, I'd never heard him say fascinating or talk about engineering anything. How long have you been standing here, Doctor? Chen asked. Mike looked confused. I don't know. A few minutes? I was just. He trailed off, staring at the water wheel again. They built this to last. Quality craftsmanship. Takes a real artisan to cut gears this precise with hand tools. That definitely wasn't Mike talking. He was studying archaeology, not historical engineering. And something about the way he stood was wrong too. Straighter, more formal, like someone from a different time period. Mike, I said carefully, what year is it? What kind of question is that? He asked, but there was uncertainty in his voice. It's 1984. November. We came here to study the archaeological site. The words were right, but he said them like he was reading from a script, like he had to think hard to remember information that should have been automatic. Dr. Chen caught my eye and nodded toward the door. We backed out of the mill, leaving Mike staring at the water wheel. Something's wrong with him, she whispered once we were outside. Something's wrong with this whole place, I said. The warm bread, the fresh stew, the footprints that just disappear. And now Mike acting like he's someone else. There has to be a rational explanation. People don't just vanish. Buildings don't preserve themselves for 200 years. And students don't suddenly start talking like colonial craftsmen. But even as she said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. Dr. Chen was a scientist, trained to find logical explanations for everything. But this place was challenging everything she believed about how the world worked. That's when the snow started falling. It began as a few lazy flakes drifting down through the gray afternoon light. Within minutes, it was coming down hard and fast. The kind of sudden, mountain storm that can dump 3 feet of snow before you realize what's happening. The wind picked up too, howling through the trees around the settlement and making the cabin doors creak on their hinges. We need to get Rodriguez and Amy, Dr. Chen said, raising her voice over the wind. Set up shelter, this storm's moving in fast. We found Rodriguez in the blacksmith shop, but like Mike, something was wrong with him. He was working the bellows on the forge, pumping air into coals that glowed bright red. When we called his name, he looked up with eyes that seemed to see right through us. Storm's coming, he said in a voice that wasn't quite his own. Need to get the tools ready. Never know how long we'll be snowed in. Rodriguez, we need to leave. Now. The weather's getting dangerous. But he just went back to working the bellows, like we weren't even there. When Dr. Chen tried to grab his arm, he pulled away with surprising strength. Can't stop now, he said. Too much work to do before the storm hits. Families need horseshoes, nails, tools for repairs. Winter's hard on equipment. Amy was worse. We found her in the meeting house, sitting at the wooden table with those colonial documents spread out in front of her, but she wasn't taking notes or photographs anymore. She was writing with a quill pen, adding entries to what looked like a supply ledger. Amy, Dr. Chen said gently, Amy, look at me. She glanced up, and for a second I saw confusion in her eyes, like she was fighting to remember who she was. Then it was gone, replaced by the polite expression of a colonial woman addressing strangers. Good afternoon, she said in a voice that carried a faint accent I couldn't place. I'm afraid we weren't expecting visitors today. Have you come far? Dr. Chen grabbed my arm. We need to get out of here, right now. But when we looked outside, the snow was already ankle-deep and falling so hard we could barely see the trees. At the edge of the settlement, the wind was howling like a living thing, and the temperature was dropping fast. We were trapped. As darkness fell over the valley, I saw lights beginning to flicker in the cabin windows. Not electric lights, the warm, yellow glow of candles and oil lamps. From where we stood in the meeting house doorway, the settlement looked exactly like it must have in 1755. Smoke rising from chimneys, soft light in every window, the sounds of people going about their evening routines. Do you hear that? Dr. Chen whispered. I listened. Under the wind and the snow, I could hear voices. Conversations from inside the cabins. Children laughing. The sound of someone chopping wood. A dog barking. All the normal sounds of a living community. But when we looked closer, when we tried to see the people making those sounds, there was no one there. Just empty rooms with lights that shouldn't exist and fires that burned without anyone to tend them. That's when I realized the truth about this place. The settlement hadn't been abandoned in 1755. The people hadn't left. They'd died here. And somehow, they were still dying here, over and over again, trapped in that terrible winter that never ended. And now my team was starting to join them. By full dark, the storm had turned into a blizzard. Snow was coming down so hard I couldn't see from one cabin to the next, and the wind was howling like all the demons in hell. Dr. Chen and I huddled in the meeting house, watching our team members through the windows as they moved around the settlement like sleepwalkers. Mike was still at the mill, working by lamplight even though there was no grain to grind. Rodriguez had the forge glowing red-hot, hammering on pieces of metal that disappeared the moment he set them aside. Amy sat at her table, writing endlessly in ledgers that never seemed to fill up. "They're not just acting strange," Dr. Chen said, her breath visible in the cold air. "They're becoming someone else, like the original settlers are taking them over." I'd been thinking the same thing. In the stories my grandmother told, Josiah Flintlock's settlement had been cut off by the worst winter storm in living memory. 25 families, trapped in this valley with no way out and no way to get supplies. They'd held out as long as they could, but one by one, they'd frozen to death. "The people who died here," I said slowly, "they're still trying to survive that winter. Still trying to prepare, still trying to make it through until spring." "That's impossible. You're talking about ghosts." "What would you call it, Doctor?" Chen didn't answer. She was a scientist. But she was also watching her graduate students turn into colonial settlers before her eyes. Sometimes, reality doesn't care what you believe. The door to the meeting house opened, letting in a blast of snow and freezing air. Mike stepped inside, but it wasn't really Mike anymore. He moved differently, held himself straighter, and when he looked at us, his eyes held the weight of someone much older. "Good evening," he said in that formal way that belonged to a different century. "I'm Thomas Whitmore, miller for this settlement. I don't believe we've been introduced." "Doctor." Chen pressed back against the wall. "Mike, it's me, Dr. Chen. You're a graduate student at Virginia Tech. We came here to study archaeological remains." Mike, or Thomas, or whoever he was now, looked confused for a moment. Then he shook his head like he was clearing away cobwebs. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think you're mistaken. This is 1755, and we're preparing for what promises to be a hard winter. Storm's already started, and from the look of it, we won't be seeing clear skies for some time." That's when I understood. The original settlers had died during the blizzard of 1755, but somehow their last moments, their desperate fight to survive, had become trapped in this place. Like a record playing the same song over and over. And now that we were here, now that we'd touched their belongings and walked in their footsteps, we were becoming part of that endless loop. "Thomas," I said carefully, "what happened to the settlement? To the families who lived here?" His face went dark. "We lost some folk early on. The Henderson baby took sick and died first week of the storm. Then old Samuel Morris froze to death in his cabin when his firewood ran out. After that," he paused, looking around the meeting house like he was seeing ghosts. "After that, it got bad real fast. Through the windows, I could see more figures moving around the settlement. People who hadn't been there an hour ago, but who looked solid and real in the lamplight. Men carrying armloads of firewood that vanished before they reached their doors. Women hanging laundry on lines in the middle of a blizzard. Children playing in snow that seemed to fall upward instead of down." "How many died?" I asked. "All of us," Thomas said simply. "Every last soul. Froze to death or starved before spring came. But we kept trying. Right up to the end, we kept trying to make it through." Dr. Chen grabbed my arm. "Cornelius, we have to get out of here. Before whatever's happening to them happens to us." But when I looked outside, I realized we weren't going anywhere. The blizzard had gotten worse, and the snow was already drifting 3 feet deep against the buildings. Even if we could find our way through the storm, we'd freeze to death before we made it a mile. We were trapped, just like the original settlers had been. "Thomas," I said, "I need to tell you something. My name is Cornelius Flintlock. Josiah Flintlock was my ancestor." Thomas stared at me for a long moment. Then his eyes went wide, and for just a second, I saw Mike Rodriguez fighting to surface through the colonial persona that had taken him over. "Flintlock," Thomas repeated. "Josiah founded this settlement. Led us all here, promised us good land and a chance at prosperity." His voice turned bitter. Instead, He led us to our deaths. It wasn't his fault. He couldn't have known about the storm, couldn't he? Thomas stepped closer, and I could feel cold radiating from him like he was made of winter itself. This valley was cursed ground. The Cherokee knew it. They warned us. But Josiah was so sure he could tame any wilderness, survive any winter. The door opened again, and more figures came in from the storm. I recognized Amy, but she moved like a colonial woman now, her posture formal and her eyes holding the patient sadness of someone who'd already accepted death. Behind her came Rodriguez, but he looked different too. Older, wearing clothes that belonged to a blacksmith from 2 centuries ago. "The storm's getting worse," Amy said in her new voice. "We should gather in the meeting house, share what warmth we can." More people filed in. People I'd never seen before, but who looked as real as anyone. Families with children, elderly couples, young men who should have been in the prime of their lives. All of them with that same look of desperate hope mixed with growing despair. And in the back, barely visible in the lamplight, I saw him. Josiah Flintlock looked exactly like the portrait my grandmother had kept on her mantelpiece, tall and strong, with dark hair and eyes that burned with determination. But there was something broken in those eyes now, something that spoke of failure and guilt and the weight of 25 families who'd followed him to their deaths. "Cornelius," he said, and his voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "You shouldn't have come here." "Neither should you," I said. "You should have listened to the Cherokee warnings, should have known this land didn't want to be settled." "Should have, could have," Josiah said bitterly. Easy words for someone who wasn't there. Someone who didn't have families looking to him for leadership, for a chance at a better life. "Doctor." Chen was pressed against the wall, staring at the growing crowd of settlers who filled the meeting house. Some of them looked solid and real, others flickered like candle flames, sometimes there and sometimes not. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This can't be real." "Real enough," said an elderly woman I didn't recognize. "Real enough that we've been living it for 200 years. Real enough that we'll keep living it until someone breaks the cycle." "How?" I asked. "How do we break it?" Josiah laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't, boy. You become part of it. Just like your friends are doing. Just like anyone who comes to this cursed valley." I looked around the room. My team was completely gone now, replaced by colonial settlers who wore their faces but moved with the mannerisms of people from a different time. And I could feel something pulling at me too. A voice in my head that whispered about winter preparations and survival duties, and the need to help the community make it through the storm. But I fought it. I had something the original settlers didn't have. I knew how the story ended. "You're all dead," I said loudly, and the room went quiet. "Every one of you froze to death in the winter of 1755. This storm, this settlement, this endless struggle to survive, it's over. You lost. You all died." Some of the settlers looked confused, like they were remembering something they'd tried to forget. Others looked angry, their faces twisting with rage at having their desperate hope challenged. "Lies," Josiah snarled. "We're still here, still fighting. Spring will come eventually." "Spring came in 1756, I said, "and searchers found your bodies scattered around this valley, frozen, solid. You've been dead for 230 years. The temperature in the room dropped even further. Frost began forming on the windows, and I could see my breath in white puffs. The settlers pressed closer, their eyes burning with the kind of fury that comes from having your deepest denial exposed. "If we're dead," Josiah said, his voice like winter wind, "then so are you." The settlers surged forward, and I felt their cold hands grabbing at me. But instead of fighting them, I did something they didn't expect. I acknowledged them. "You're right," I said, letting my voice carry to every corner of the room. "You did die here. All of you, and it was terrible, and it was unfair, and you fought as hard as anyone could have fought." The hands stopped grabbing. The angry voices fell silent. "Josiah," I continued, looking directly at my ancestor, "you led these families here because you believed in them, because you thought they deserved better than scratching out a living on worn-out farmland back east. You weren't wrong about that. But we failed," Josiah said, and for the first time his voice sounded human instead of ghostly. "We all died because of my choices. You died because sometimes good people make good decisions and still lose. Because sometimes the wilderness wins. No matter how brave or smart or determined you are, that doesn't make you failures. That makes you human. I could see some of the settlers starting to flicker, becoming less solid. The desperate energy that had kept them trapped here was beginning to fade. The storm was worse than anyone could have predicted, I said. No one could have survived it. But your sacrifice wasn't meaningless. Other settlers learned from what happened here. They chose better locations, prepared differently, listened more carefully to the warnings. Your deaths helped save lives. Dr. Chen was staring at me like I'd lost my mind, but I could see understanding starting to dawn in her eyes. These weren't just ghosts or supernatural entities. They were people who died with unfinished business, trapped by their own guilt and desperation. Josiah, I said, it's time to let go. It's time to let them all go. My ancestor looked around the room at the families who'd followed him into this valley. Families who'd been trapped here for over 2 centuries, reliving their worst moments over and over. I don't know how, he said quietly. Just stop fighting, I said. Stop trying to survive. Accept that it's over. One by one, the settlers began to fade. The elderly woman who'd spoken earlier smiled at me with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. And then she was gone. The families with children went next, parents holding their little ones as they dissolved into the cold air. Then the young men, the craftsmen, the farmers who dreamed of prosperity in a new land. Thomas Whitmore, who was really Mike Rodriguez, looked at me with confusion returning to his eyes. Cornelius, what happened? Where are we? It's okay, I said. You're back now. Amy and Rodriguez were themselves again too, shaking their heads like they were waking up from deep dreams. They remembered being in the settlement, but the memories of being colonial settlers were already fading like fragments of a nightmare. Only Josiah remained, standing in the middle of the now empty meeting house. I led them here, he said. I convinced them this was the right choice. You led them on an adventure, I corrected. They chose to follow because they believed in the dream you offered. That's not your fault. Will you tell their story? He asked. Will you make sure people remember what really happened here? I will, I promised. Josiah Flintlock smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him. You're a good man, Cornelius. The family name is in good hands. And then he was gone too, leaving just the 4 of us standing in a colonial meeting house that suddenly felt very old and very empty. The storm had stopped. Through the windows, I could see stars shining in a clear sky, and the snow had stopped falling. But the cold was still bitter, and we needed to get out of this valley before hypothermia set in. We packed up quickly, not talking about what had happened until we were miles away from the settlement. Even then, we spoke in whispers, like we were afraid the dead might hear us. Dr. Chen wrote up the site as historically significant, but recommended against further excavation. She cited unstable weather conditions and difficult access, but I knew the real reason. Some places are meant to stay buried. I went back once, 5 years later, alone. The settlement was still there, but different. The buildings were weathered now, showing their true age. Windows were broken, roofs sagged, and weeds grew between the foundation stones. It looked exactly like what it should have looked like all along, the ruins of a place where people had lived and died more than 2 centuries ago. But sometimes, on very cold nights when the wind blows just right through these mountains, I can still hear the church bell ringing. Just once, soft and distant, like a reminder that some stories never really end. And sometimes I wonder if there are other places like this, scattered through these ancient hills. Other settlements that tried to tame land that didn't want to be tamed. Other families who made brave choices and paid terrible prices. The Cherokee were right about this valley. Some ground stays wild no matter what you build on it. Some places remember the blood that was spilled and the dreams that died, and they hold on to those memories long after the people who made them have turned to dust. I still work as a ranger in Jefferson National Forest. I still lead hiking groups and tell stories about the old days. But I'm more careful now about which stories I tell, and I'm very careful about which parts of the forest I take people to visit. Because I've learned that the past isn't always past, and the dead don't always stay buried. And somewhere in these mountains, in hidden valleys that don't appear on any map, there are still settlers who never settled. Still trying to survive winters that ended lifetimes ago. Still waiting for a spring that will never come.